Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to working session 3 of the Human Dimension Implementation meeting. My name is Alexander Schlick. I'm the head of ODIHR election department, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's session 3. As you know, the working session 3 is dedicated to the topic of democratic institutions, including democracy at the national, regional, local levels, and democratic elections. Allow me to introduce the topic very briefly before we proceed. With regard to democratic elections, the OSCE participating states have committed themselves to upholding key principles of democratic elections as an essential element underpinning genuine democracy. They explicitly recognized the significance of the democratic elections and gave ODIHR a mandate to support them in implementing their election-related commitments by undertaking election observation and assisting in the follow-up to electoral assessments and recommendations. ODIHR's election observation activities contribute to tangible improvements in electoral processes across the OSCE region. Over the last several years, improvements include strengthened legal frameworks, greater attention to the inclusion of women in the elections, increased participation and protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, and deeper understanding of advantages and risks associated with new technologies in elections. Progress is, however, uneven. Particular issues of concern remain, such as limitations placed on suffrage rights, challenges to freedom of expression and media environment, lack of confidence in and impartiality of election administration bodies, and shrinking space for citizen election observers. With regard to democracy at the national, regional, and local levels, in the 1990 Copenhagen document, participating states committed to the protection of fundamental freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law, and nurturing and developing democratic institutions at all levels, national, local, and regional. They also stated that vigorous democracy depends on the existence of an extensive range of democratic institutions, values, and practices being an integral part of national life. Across the OSCE region, attempts to substantially alter the balance of democratic powers are clearly visible today. While legislatures in numerous OSCE participating states retain their important oversight roles, it should be stressed that pluralism in the institution of parliament is an implied yet fundamental component of OSCE commitments. During today's session, we will have an opportunity to take stock of progress in the implementation of OSCE commitments on democratic institutions and political pluralism, and to review electoral practices and efforts of the participating states to follow up on ODIHR electoral assessments and recommendations in compliance with OSCE commitments, international obligations, and standards. In the annotated agenda, we have the questions that could be addressed. I kindly ask those who will be taking the floor during today's session to focus on the questions that we proposed to be addressed, to focus on the topic of this thematic session, and to be constructive and to provide concrete recommendations. I would urge the participants to start their contributions from providing recommendations and then use the time allocated to provide an explanation and background for their recommendations. This session will last 3 hours. The first 15 minutes are dedicated to my opening words, which I'm concluding with now, technical information, which I'm doing right now, and the remarks by our introducer. This will be followed by the time for the interventions from the floor. During the last 15 minutes, delegations of OSCE participating states will have a possibility to exercise their right of reply, and if there is time, we will hear final summary reflections from the introducer, after which I will close the session. As I said in the beginning, we have to finish at 6 o'clock due to the strict interpreters' requirements, and that is why I will have to be strict in enforcing the time limits. I kindly ask for your understanding of this. I know that the list of speakers is full. We already have several speakers on the reserve list, which is an extra motivation for me to enforce the speaking times. I'd like to remind that participants can only speak in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can take the floor. As always, seats in this hall are designated as indicated on signs placed around the table, and I ask all participants to respect the seating arrangements throughout the session. There is live streaming of this session. With this, I would like to proceed to introducing our distinguished guest, our introducer for this session, Ambassador Urszula Gacek. Ambassador Urszula Gacek is a former senior diplomat in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's a former Poland's permanent representative to the Council of Europe and Consul General in New York. During her time in Strasbourg, she chaired a key ambassadorial body, the Committee of Ministers Rapporteur Group on Democracy, for a 2-year term. As Consul General in New York, she was responsible for the coordination and oversight of presidential and parliamentary elections and national referendum in the New York Consular District. She has also held an elected office as both the member of a Polish Senate and of the European Parliament. She's an experienced electoral observer, having been both a short-term observer with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and more recently as the head of mission for ODIHR. Allow me to add that on top of her political and diplomatic expertise, Ambassador Urszula Gacek is also an accomplished business owner. Born and educated in the United Kingdom, she holds a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Oxford. I am very pleased that she is joining us today, and I'm very glad to pass the floor now to Ambassador Urszula Gacek. Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Director. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, being the introducer for this working session on elections and democracy at national, regional, and local level, being tasked with the job of giving my reflections on the issues raised in the annotated agenda in the space of less than 10 minutes is no easy undertaking. These reflections are my own, drawing from my experience as a politician, diplomat, and most recently election observer. My aim? To encourage discussion around those issues where the participating states, by their policies and practices, can work individually or jointly to address the challenges we face. So let me start with the subject of elections. At a press conference following elections where I recently acted as head of mission for ODIHR, I was asked bluntly, why does ODIHR bother to monitor elections in my country? Indeed, why do we bother? Well, first and foremost, because the participating states have explicitly given the ODIHR a mandate to conduct election observation and assist in the follow-up to electoral assessments with recommendations. And secondly, because we do make a difference. Let me highlight just a few areas where ODIHR observations and the subsequent all-important recommendations are leading to improvements, being, of course, fully aware that much still needs to be done and that new challenges are constantly emerging. In his introduction, our moderator mentioned where we have seen improvements in elections in recent years. Let me address those points that he raised. Often overlooked, real progress has been made in strengthening electoral frameworks. Please bear in mind that almost half of the OSCE participating states had no legal framework for democratic elections 3 decades ago. When a state accepts ODIHR recommendations and implements them, the results are tangible. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those officials from the participating states who have contributed by their hard work and commitment to improving legal framework for elections. They rarely receive the praise they deserve. On women in elections, let me say that it is encouraging to see legislation in the participating states that ensures gender balance on, for example, party lists. However, the placement of female candidates on both closed and open lists where certain places are favored may still need to be addressed. Remember, the first true test is not how many female candidates there are, but how many successful female candidates there are. And if we look at the makeup of many of our parliaments, it is clear that the issue of gender balance has not been satisfactorily resolved. But this is only the first true test. The second is the role women parliamentarians play. Are they adequately represented in parliamentary committees? Do they act as committee chairpersons? Are they rapporteurs on subjects other than those traditionally regarded as the female domain, like family, health, and education? Are we seeing them speaking on foreign policy, public finance, and defense? I recall in my time of being the only female member of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee here in Poland, and each committee session would be opened with the greeting, "Good morning, gentlemen," after which I would clear my throat and the chairman would add, "And Madam Senator." The wheelchair symbol, indicating that a polling station is accessible to persons with mobility problems, does not close the matter of disenfranchisement of persons with disabilities. While it is encouraging to see regard being given to easy physical access to polling stations, as well as to the problems of the visually impaired on election day, the enfranchisement of persons with hidden disabilities, especially those with mental disabilities, is still a work in progress in many participating states. It is always heartening to see citizen observers at polling stations on election day. Indeed, this is where most citizen observers focus their attention. We must consider, however, whether they are able to fully participate in the entire process, for example, follow all the activities of the electoral bodies, as well as having unrestricted access to tabulation procedures. Here it's interesting to note that international observers are often afforded greater rights to observe than domestic citizen observers. I recall one election where I, as an international observer, was able to approach the table where polling station officials were working, whilst the domestic observers were required to remain at the other side of the room, effectively being barred from scrutinizing the process. This discrimination of domestic observers is regrettable, for as citizens of the country where the election is taking place, they have the greatest interest in the process they are observing. The wider issue of freedoms granted to civil society organizations, including their funding and restrictions on their funding, also needs to be considered, as this has a direct bearing on the scale and quality of the observation they are able to conduct. Our moderator also mentioned the use of new election day technologies. Let me share with you my reflection on the use of live streaming of activities in polling stations. Intended as a measure to increase transparency and promote voter confidence in procedures, they are sometimes viewed with suspicion by voters who fear that the secrecy of the vote may be compromised, despite the fact that the cameras are positioned in a way that does not allow for this. Where we see instances of vote buying or voter intimidation, this Big Brother camera is not helpful in promoting confidence in the system. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, when we think of the challenges to democratic elections today, the sinister use of the internet and social media immediately spring to mind. Let me say, however, that there is a very positive role for the internet and social media to play in the election process. Social media is providing an accessible and cost-effective platform for political parties and candidates to inform and reach out to voters and even to legitimately raise campaign funds. However, the sinister side of online activities cannot be ignored. These include the possibility of manipulating public opinion through misleading or dishonest information, the ease of rapid and targeted dissemination of such information using profiling techniques, troll farms, and bots. Most worrying, these sometimes include state-sponsored activities. Observation of the media by election observation missions needs to adapt to these trends, as so many of the activities which hugely impact voter opinion are currently below our election observation radar. These under-the-radar activities also have implications for transparency of campaign funding. How should we monitor these activities? How do the policies and practices in the participating states ensure that all parties and candidates adhere to the principle of what is not permitted offline is not permitted online? Maybe our debate will give us some answers. So, back to the question, why does ODIHR bother to observe elections? Well, this question actually was an expression of dissatisfaction with the fact that election after election, some participating states ignore our key recommendations. Please remember, election observation is not an end in itself. The value of assessments and recommendations is contingent upon the will of the OSCE participating states to take them into account when reforming electoral processes. Oh, by the way, how did I answer the question? Well, I still believe it is better to observe, to draw attention to problems, to make those recommendations, even if many of them are ignored, than to give up on attempts to constantly improve the quality of democratic elections. Not much time, but let me now turn to the second subject in this afternoon's session, namely to democracy at the national, regional, and local level. Let me reiterate what our moderator said. The commitments made, what was laid down in the 1990 Copenhagen Agreement, this commitment to the protection of fundamental freedom, human rights, rule of law, nurturing and developing democratic institutions. The existence of legal and factual conditions for the peaceful expression of a political opposition, both inside and outside the Parliament, remains an essential component of a well-functioning democracy. Today, we see an increasing number of cases where parliamentary opposition is being marginalised through bending and even breaking the rules of parliamentary procedure. This may lead to such a level of frustration within the opposition that they boycott the Parliament altogether and so set up a vicious circle of further marginalisation. Finally, let me go back to the 1990 Copenhagen document. It states clearly that vigorous democracy depends on the existence of an extensive range of democratic institutions. All the participating states have agreed to protect them. In 1748, Montesquieu, inspired by the example of the Roman Republic, set down the principle of the separation of powers between legislature, executive, and judiciary. This principle has guided drafters of all modern constitutions from 1787 onwards, and now it appears increasingly irksome to some of our governments. Citizens, voters, most often consider this to be an abstract concept, having no immediate relevance for them. Furthermore, disillusioned with political elites, with the establishment, often grappling with their own day-to-day problems created by economic austerity, they rarely rally around slogans calling for the need to respect the separation of powers. Levitsky, in his book How Democracies Die, commented, "Citizens are often slow to realize that their democracy is being dismantled even as it happens before their eyes." If this rings a bell, I would argue that this should be an alarm bell, as undermining the basic principle of the separation of powers, slowly chipping away at it in plain view of the citizen, poses, in my opinion, the greatest danger to democracy today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, Ambassador. It is a pleasure, and it's a very inspiring introduction to our topic today. As you could hear from the introductory remarks, elections and the democracy at national, regional, and local level is both a political concept and is also a technical process. And I hope that, and I know that the expertise that Ambassador brings to the table of being both a former politician, former ambassador, and an election observer has highlighted a number of those aspects. I'm especially grateful for how you highlighted that a lot of work remains to be done with regard to women's participation in elections, to promoting and protecting the participation of persons with disabilities in elections as well, and how the increasing use of the internet for conducting political activity and campaigns has both positive and negative sides. I think this is a great inspiration for today's discussion. As I mentioned in the beginning, the list is full. Therefore, we will have to be limiting the speaking time. The speaking time will be limited to 2.5 minutes per speaker. I once again call on all participants to make sure that all interventions are presented in a meaningful, orderly, respectful manner, observing the time limit and focusing on recommendations related to the topic of this session. Please keep comments brief and to the point, starting with recommendations related to the session's topic. Please, I would like to encourage you not to read the written statements, but if you have prepared the statements, please submit them before taking the floor to the interpreters. That will definitely help them. You can also distribute the statements through the documents distribution desk, and the flow of the documents will reflect the discussion. Once again, the speaking time is limited to 2.5 minutes. And with this, I will open the floor to the contributions. The first speaker on my list is Poland on behalf of the European Union, to be followed by the Movement for the Renaissance of the Northern Epirus. Poland, on behalf of the European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm honored to present this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states: North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Moldova, Georgia, Andorra have aligned themselves to this statement. The EU is fully committed to fostering the values and principles of democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights, including civil and political rights, and that of persons belonging to minorities worldwide. Strong democratic institutions at the national, regional, and local levels help ensure transparency and accountability, long-term growth and stability, and active involvement of citizens in the decision-making process. Our recommendations in relation to this session are the following. First, participating state shall take all appropriate measures to increase participation of persons belonging to underrepresented groups in decision-making and political life. In particular, a strong emphasis should be placed on the involvement of women, youth, and persons belonging inter alia to national, ethnic, and religious minorities, as well as persons with disabilities. 2. We invite participating states to further enhance transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness of elections, encourage political pluralism, and to make sure that the voters are given a genuine democratic choice. 3. Participating states shall ensure adequate conditions for the development of effective local democracy. 4. Participating states shall further engage in promoting genuine dialogue with civil society, including in international fora, and refrain from imposing unnecessary limitation on activities of the civil society organization. They shall also enhance efforts to protect human rights defenders from any persecution or infringements on their human rights. We encourage the participating states to actively support freedom of the media, which constitute a prerequisite for credible, inclusive, and transparent democratic processes. 6. We advocate for a closer cooperation with other election observation missions through extending early and unrestricted invitation, which enable ODIHR to conduct a needs assessment mission in a timely manner, as well as through engaging on a follow-up activities, especially by implementing ODIHR recommendation and submitting voluntary reports to the OSCE Human Dimension Committee. 7. We call on participating
kindly ask
states.
You to conclude.
I'm coming to
Thank
an
you.
end. We call on participating states to make sure that ODIHR has sufficient resources to conduct its activities, as well as to continue seconding observers or contributing to the ODIHR Observation Sustainability Fund. 8. Last point, we also encourage the participating states to further develop cooperation with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in the overall OSCE work in the field of election observation. The full statement will be distributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I especially thank you for the concrete and precise recommendations. The next speaker on my list is the Movement for the Renaissance of the Northern Epirus, to be followed by the World Uyghur Congress. The movement,
Honorable representatives, municipal elections were held in Albania on June 30, 2019. The opposition abstained and did not recognize the process. The same did the President of the Albanian Republic, who declared that these elections were not legal, and he did not recognize the result. The candidates were all from the ruling Socialist Party. In some municipalities, the governing party also supported some independent or coalition local people just for the pretexts. But the condemnation of these tactics came from all sides. In the case of the municipality of Himara, where Greek national minority lives, we faced a gross violation of human rights and democracy, with the exclusion of its candidate, Fredis Beleris. In the municipality of Himara, the property of the members of the Greek national minority is being confiscated with vile methods that go beyond any legal concept and clear human rights violation. On the issue of representation at the level of national elections, unlike other European countries, there is no quantitative representation of the Greek national minority in the Albanian parliament. The current electoral system forces the parties representing the Greek national minority to join the coalition of major Albanian parties to have any chance of success. Also, there is no provision for the participation of representatives of the Greek minority
excuse me, I
parties.
see a point of order. Please, Albania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I want to say that this is not true, and I reserve the right to come back to this issue. And I request that because we have spoken in many occasions about this issue, and all of the laws with regard to the minorities.
Excuse me,
so please.
I'd like to point out that you will be able to exercise the right of reply in the end of the session. In the meantime, I return the floor to the speaker.
Also, there is no provision for the participation of representatives of the Greek minority parties in the electoral commissions, which results a significant rigging of the election results, especially in the areas where the Greek minority resides. At the same time, the Albanian state has divided the single geographical area in which it recognized the existence of a Greek minority in just different regions, Argyro-Castro and Avlona or Vlore. Thus, in many areas, the existence of the Greek national minority is not recognized at all. The census data are far from representing the reality, and they are a clear attempt to nullify the presence of the Greek national minority. The Greek national minority in Albania urgently needs institutional protection to be able to survive from the ethnic cleansing plans. The whole text in the documentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is the World Uyghur Congress, to be followed by the International Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes. The World Uyghur Congress, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Democracy, democratic institutions, human rights, and common values form the backbone of our international system that has led to relative peace and prosperity. However, the concept of democracy and the democratic values underpinning this system are under attack like never before. We have been witnessing a general slide to authoritarianism, and the undermining of our democratic values will have major security implications for OSCE members and for free and fair elections. This attack on democracy has been led by a number of undemocratic states who are proposing an alternative model of development that deprives citizens of a voice, violates their basic human rights, and strips them of their individuality. The Chinese government in particular has trumpeted its unique model of repression and development as a model for other countries to follow. The greatest challenge to the concept of democracy and human rights can be seen in our international institutions, particularly in the UN Human Rights Council. China, Russia, and a number of other states are actively seeking to undermine democratic values and the very concept of human rights in the UN. In February 2017, the Chinese mission, along with a group of sympathetic states, tried to pass a resolution which would have neutered all UN human rights mechanisms. It was only due to the intervention of EU member states that this measure was not implemented. We saw this again this summer, at the Human Rights Council, where the issue of China arbitrarily detaining over 1 million innocent Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in internment camps was raised. In July 2019, 22 states issued a joint statement urging China to end these mass arbitrary detentions and related violations against Uyghurs in China. In response, 37 states signed a letter defending the internment camps and China's repression of Uyghurs. How have we reached the point where 37 states, including Russia and other US OSCE members, actively support and defend a crime against humanity in the UN? How can we say that we as an international community respect human rights and democratic values when states are willing to support one of the largest arbitrary detentions in modern human history more than defend these values? This has become a litmus test for the international community's commitment to human rights and democratic values. So far, we are failing miserably. A coalition of authoritarian states against human rights and democracy is challenging our democratic institutions, the concept of human rights, and the very foundations of our international system. Sadly, many policymakers don't seem to take our international architecture and democratic values for granted. For the vast majority of human history, there has been no constraints of power, no right to have a say in governance, and no moral imperative to care about the lives and well-being of people far away from you simply because they're human. If OSCE member states do not address this threat and vigorously defend democracy and human rights at the local, national, regional, and international level, the future will look bleak. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is the International Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes, to be followed by the Latvian Human Rights Committee. The International Association, you have the floor.
Thanks. Dear participant, sorry, minimal text. There are dictatorship states, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and aggressive Russia. And again, sorry, Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan has the authoritarian system again. But we hope Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have the opportunity of the way to the democracy. Dictatorship have not democratic election. It is absolute. Citizens in the dictatorship states have not the opportunity for the fair voting. We have election spectacle is next dictatorship. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and for the declaration of the dictatorship of Lukashenko, the election spectacle, parliament election for October. We propose to have your attention next issue. Azerbaijan. The dictator Ilham Aliyev showed he is the law. He appointed the election spectacle, and his spectacle was April. And we saw election spectacle only. Kazakhstan, after the resignation of Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan had election at June. But election were not democratic election. Kazakhstan had very large democratic protest. More 4,000 persons have been detained, and next 1,000 have been punished with no fair trial. And Russia, for this state, we see the dictator Vladimir Putin is a good pupil of the dictator Lukashenko. Election spectacle in Russia was at September and had many protest action by democratic people. Belarus, the dictator Lukashenko does not respect constitution. Lukashenko appointed election to the fake parliament in November this year. It is very hard violation of the constitution, Article 93, 94, 95. There are very hard conditions with constitution for stop the activity of the parliament. Today, Belarus has not same condition. And next,
I kindly ask you to conclude.
Oh, thank you very much. But and to OSCE, we support your proposition for the role of civil society and right for fair trial. And we have not this question at this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is the Latvian Human Rights Committee, to be followed by the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. The Latvian Human Rights Committee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And about the situation in Latvia. The small Republic of Latvia remains the first in the European Union by the absolute number of stateless persons. Mostly those with the status is or so-called non-citizen of Latvia. As of January 1, 2019, the status is held by 224,000 people included in the population register, or almost 11% of the population, or 13% among voting age population. All members of this group belong to ethnic minorities. 43% of the non-citizens have been born in Latvia, and 38% are 65 and older. These people remain voteless. This makes it simple to perpetuate exclusion of parties representing ethnic minorities from forming the government on national level. Votelessness applies even in local election, contrary to recommendation of many international bodies, including OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and High Commissioner on National Minority. The naturalization is telling. In 2018, the number of non-citizens fell by 80,000, but 10% of them were naturalized by Latvia. Thus, mortality is the main reason of the reduction of the number of non-citizens. And in September 2019, the Parliament of Latvia considers a bill of granting citizenship to newborn children of non-citizens. However, it is a feel-good measure only for two reasons. It doesn't concern thousands of children, non-citizens, already born. The right to nationality granted by the Convention of the Right of the Child remains denied. It should be noted that automatic granting of citizenship to children has been recommended by many international bodies, including OSCE High Commissioner on National Minority. United Nations Human Rights Committee currently considers two communications from Latvia on electoral issues.
Kindly ask you to conclude, please.
One is the requirement of high skills in Latvian language, and the other concerning prohibition of independent candidates. Recommendation for Latvia: to grant to all permanent residents, including non-citizens of Latvia, foreigners and stateless people recognized under 1954
Excuse me,
Convention.
I once again ask you to conclude, please. Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation, to be followed by Political Movement Group 24. Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my statement, I would like briefly to say a few words about democratic institutions and so-called democratic elections that take place in a whole number of states that have the official title of participating states in the OSCE. I mean, we've already heard some jokes about how elections are held in the Russian Federation, but I can tell you that in an unstable state like Libya, there are elections. Now, it's not a democratic state, but according to studies carried out by Freedom House and Worldwide Freedom Press Index, there have been assessments. I mean, in Libya, no constitution has been adopted. There is no law about elections. No elections have been announced. And yet, there were arrests of two Russian political scientists. They were put into a terrible prison where they're kept in inhuman conditions. A tanker captain, Vladimir Chekalin, was in that prison for 3 years, and he just came back to the Russian Federation. He told us how military personnel torture people there, and the authorities in Tripoli are in fact terrorists. This is a regime that is torturing hundreds or even thousands of foreign citizens. We only have 2 Russians there at the present time, but there are hundreds of other citizens there who are not from Libya.
Discussion here, because I'm just not sure that speakers actually speaking to the topic. Thank you.
I kindly ask the speaker to bring the contribution to the topic of this session.
Абсолютно верно.
Certainly. In closing, I will do that. I'm talking about so-called elections that is referred to as a partner of the OSCE, and I would like the OSCE and the participating states to take into consideration what is happening in a state that is an official partner of the OSCE, with prisons where hundreds of foreign citizens are being held and tortured.
Libya is not a partner for cooperation, the OSCE, so again, I ask my question about relevance.
You are correct, but I also see that the speaker has exhausted the time limit. We will move on in
Мне
the...
странно, да, почему Канада поддерживает.
I find it very strange to hear Canada supporting this.
list is the Political Movement Group 24, to be followed by the United States of America. Political Movement Group 24, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ilshad Sharipov, the Political Group 24. In order to achieve real democracy, we need to make sure that for all democratic institutions to be independent, self-sufficient, and work properly. Unfortunately, Kazakhstan, the country is going from democracy to dictatorship. Although in the past we had civil society, although it was weak, today it has been fully destroyed by the dictatorship regime. Although in the Constitution there are words on the rule of law, the primacy of individual rights over the rights of the state, the right of expressing one's opinions, all of this doesn't mean that Kazakhstan is a democratic state, because this has nothing to do with the realities in the country. Today in Tajikistan, there is no real opposition left. All the existing parties in the country, especially in the parliament, have been created and are controlled by the ruling small group of people. This is why the political diversity in the country cannot exist. No laws are discussed in parliament, and practically all laws are passed exclusively in the interest of the ruling clan. For some time now, we no longer have the red button in the Tajik parliament. Basically, everyone just unanimously votes for the same laws. With regard to the media, all the media are controlled by the government in the country, and the so-called independent press or electronic media cannot work because they fear being harassed by the security services. Media also up against the problem of accrediting their journalists. Information sites are often being blocked because they are trying to present alternative points of view. Independent journalists are fleeing Tajikistan because they are being harassed by the services. For several years now, over 20 journalists have had to flee the country and have requested political asylum in North America and in Europe. The registration of the work of NGOs.
Order from Tajikistan, please.
I think we need to stick to the topic. We already talked about the media.
To adhere to the topic, and please continue.
I'm almost done. The recent practice has shown the institution of elections in Tajikistan is also there only just to imitate so-called elections. The results of all elections are decided by the ruling regime. All of the elections were under the full control of the authorities with results that were well known ahead of time. The real political powers of the country do not have the right to develop themselves. The full text will be published on the OSCE site and on the site of the Political Group 24.
The next speaker on my list is the United States of America, to be followed by the United Kingdom. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We compliment the introductory speaker on her significance on democracy as the essential human right. The United States commends the OSCE for its work to advance free and fair elections through the joint efforts of ODIHR and the Parliamentary Assembly. In Russia and Kazakhstan, restrictions on candidate registration and the freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression limit the space for political engagement, and result in a lack of legitimate competition. The Russian Federation's brutality against protesters demanding the registration of candidates they allege were wrongfully excluded from September 8th municipal elections in Moscow is a bad reflection. In Kazakhstan, authorities arrested 2 demonstrators and sentenced them to 15 days in jail for holding up a banner urging free and fair elections. The OSCE reported significant irregularities in the June presidential election, including ballot box stuffing. Last October's presidential election in Georgia and the conduct of the campaign underscores the need for new measures to fight the abuse of administrative resources and ensure the neutrality of election institutions. It's essential that that playing field be leveled before their next elections. The United States calls for Bosnia and Herzegovina to implement the decisions of the European Court on Human Rights regarding specific violation cases. We call upon the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina to implement the ODIHR recommendations. The United States is encouraged to see the collaboration between the government of Uzbekistan, ODIHR, and the Council of Europe Venice Commission on the adoption of a new electoral code. The United States commends Armenia for the conduct of its parliamentary elections in December and encourages authorities there to continue advancing electoral reforms. We support the OSCE's assessment of this year's presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine, which underscores Ukraine's commitment to democratic ideals. Ukraine achieved this positive outcome despite Russia's ongoing aggression in eastern Ukraine and wrongful occupation of Crimea. The United States welcomes ODIHR's observation of our new U.S. November elections. We appreciate the OSCE's objective assessment of the free and competitive nature of our electoral system. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is United Kingdom, to be followed by the Association of Central Asian Migrants. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I fully align with the statement given by Poland on behalf of the EU, but would like to make some remarks in my national capacity. I'd like in particular to address civil society participants. 15th of September, which was on Sunday, marked the International Day of Democracy. The theme this year was participation, recalling that at the heart of democracy are people. This reflects our OSCE commitments, notably from Copenhagen in 1990. In this, we agreed that the will of the people, freely and fairly expressed through periodic and genuine elections, is the basis of the authority and the legitimacy of all government. Given the challenging global environment, it's very important to mark the International Day of Democracy and to continue to support and encourage strong, functional democracies globally. This is particularly true in the OSCE context, as democracy, human rights, and the rule of law contribute to long-term security and prosperity. Advocating respect for these values is in all our national interests. There is a strong correlation between societies that are secure and prosperous and those that enjoy open and participative democracy. The UK supports democracy around the world, including the OSCE region. Human rights defenders play a crucial role in the democratic process, often putting themselves and their families at great personal risk. To make clear our commitment, in July, we published the UK Support for Human Rights Defender document, which sets out the type and support of UK governments can offer. The strength of any democracy can be measured by its ability to cope with strong differences of opinion and its respect for the rights of all people to exercise their fundamental freedoms that underpin democratic societies. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking to the time limit. Next speaker on my list is the Association of Central Asian Migrants, to be followed by Kazakhstan. The Association of Central Asian Migrants, you have the floor. I call on the Association for Central Asian Migrants to take the floor. Okay, we will move on. Then Please, you have the floor.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Дамы и господа.
Ladies and gentlemen, can one talk about free and democratic elections to a body that is not independent? In Tajikistan, we elect representatives to such a body, and this happens in all of the municipalities. And then there is a so-called higher chamber of the parliament where most of the representatives are appointed by the president, either directly or indirectly. In the lower house of the Tajik parliament, of the more than 100 members, 22 are chosen by parties and 41 by other authorities. So Rahman is the one who decides who sits there. And the candidates who are at the top of any list are automatically guaranteed to get in. There are 22 people who have to be approved by the authorities to get in. And in 41 of the electoral districts, the indirect system also works to make sure that the people who get in are approved by the president. And the presidents or the speakers of the local parliaments are heads of the local executive authority, appointed also by the president. All in all, then, at the local level, democracy starts and ends with the election of the president. There is simply a subsequent legitimation of legislative powers by that individual. So for the citizen, elections are just a waste of time and money. After the adoption of a recent law that is in, well, on what basis can these things be said?
You can continue, please.
Now, the elimination of candidates is unconstitutional. Under the present circumstances, then, there is no point in elections.
Please.
No, we are sticking to the time limits.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Kazakhstan, to be followed by the Politeconomy Institute of Political, Economic, and Legal Studies. Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
I'm from this Central Electoral Commission of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan fulfills all of its commitments of the OSCE, especially in the area of democratic electoral campaigns. This was confirmed once again on the 9th of June during our presidential elections. It has been noted that by 7 international organizations, it has been noted that the elections were efficient, open, competitive, transparent, and in line with the basic democratic principles. The organizations also noted that the elections were fully in line with our national laws and international standards. There were no serious breaches, and the administrative and all of the preparatory preparations were efficient. We have a very constructive attitude with regard to the recommendations of the OSCE dear election observation missions. I would like to tell you a little bit about the recommendations presented by the report. We agree that this was a very important moment for the political reforms, that the significant amount of the candidates presented a political diversity. We welcome the high marks given by them to the Electoral Commission of Kazakhstan with regard to the information and the financial information, expenditure by candidates, that they had the possibility to lodge complaints with electoral commissions or courts. At the same time, we see that certain statements in the preliminary statement, which are based on a biased approach or based on insufficient knowledge of facts. The Central Electoral Commission of Kazakhstan has already presented our comments and the detailed comments. Now, with respect to Dechin, considering ODIHR and its status, we believe that it is reasonable to say that for good cooperation, we need to have detailed recommendations and actual facts if these recommendations are to be implemented more efficiently. This will avoid any distortions and any accusation of politicization. Kazakhstan is prepared for the further working cooperatively with ODIHR. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much.
Speaker on my list is the Politiconomy Institute of Political, Economic, and Legal Studies, to be followed by Canada. Politiconomy Institute, you have the floor.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. One of the main missions of the OSCE is to assist participating states in strengthening their democratic institutions, and one of the most important phenomena of democracy is the transition of power. Bringing new elites to power. Over the last few years in the OSCE, there have been two ways of power transition. In the spring of 2018, in Armenia, the political elite was not able appropriately to run the country, and so people went out into the streets and they insisted on new people coming to power. But in the OSCE area, there is also an evolutionary system of transition of power, and that's what's happening in Kazakhstan. Thanks to this, the state has gone through a difficult political transition without any destabilization, and the new people in power have introduced a number of changes that strengthen freedom and that introduce a number of reforms in the political, social, and economic spheres. But these two forms of transition have common characteristics. What is important is that in both cases they occur from within, and they're not the result of pressure or interference from outside. And both of them have the objective of creating modern democratic societies. And the OSCE can play a very significant role of a partner for the groups that change power in such cases, and they can contribute, the OSCE can contribute to stability and peace, which is, of course, essential for all participating states of the OSCE, and particularly in Central Asia. Thank you.
Speaker on my list is Canada, to be followed by People's Movement Reforms and Development in Tajikistan. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. For Canada, it is critical that the OSCE participating states respect their OSCE commitments to democratic principles and pursue policies and programs that support civic space and democratic institutions, both domestically and internationally. We therefore make the following three recommendations. One, that OSCE participating states in ODIHR take into account the seriousness of foreign actors' efforts to undermine democracy and the ways in which we can collectively address such foreign interference in democratic processes, and to work closely with the Office of the Representative of the Freedom of the Media in this regard. Secondly, that ODIHR take into account technological threats to democracy as they emerge and engage in developing a compendium of best practices to counteract such threats. Third, that the OSCE and ODIHR continue to seek opportunities wherever possible to support civic space and democratic institutions, ensuring the broadest participation of NGOs and other civil society representatives from across the OSCE in all the events they organize. Moderator, advancing democracy and championing the values of inclusive and accountable governance are key commitments for Canada. Our position is clear. Democracy has demonstrated itself to be the best system to ensure long-term peace, economic growth, and stability, and must be protected. As has been amply pointed out, democracy is more than just holding elections. It encompasses ensuring the development of peaceful pluralism, gender equality, a robust civil society, a free and independent media, as well as respect for diversity, inclusion, human rights, the rule of law, including the right to a fair trial. Yet some parts of the OSCE region, we hear a simplistic narrative that winning elections permits the neglect of the other necessary attributes of a healthy democracy. Even worse, in some cases, we witness the active undermining of the pillars of democracy, both east and west of Vienna. Canada is committed to continuing to counter the threats to democracy and to reinforcing our own societal resilience. As an evolving challenge to democratic elections is the threat of foreign interference, intent on disruption, we are working towards addressing this and have launched a broad cross-sectoral plan to defend Canadian democracy from such threats, and have undertaken important steps to update and modernize legislation regarding Canadian electoral processes with this in mind. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to especially thank you for providing concrete recommendations, and I encourage other speakers to do the same. The next speaker on my list is the People's Movement Reforms and Development in Tajikistan, to be followed by the Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan. The People's Movement Reforms and Development in Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1992 in Tajikistan, there was Amir Rahman came to power, who killed 100,000 people.
And he killed more than 150,000 peace-loving citizens. And since that time, Tajikistan has not had any free democratic elections. In 2020 in Tajikistan, there are going to be parliamentary and presidential elections. But in Tajikistan, we don't have a single political party that could put forward an opposition candidate. There really is no alternative to the tyrant Rahman. All political parties that have participated in the current elections are simply nominal, and they really do not represent democracy in Tajikistan. Over 27 years, Emomali Rahman has brought Tajikistan into a severe economic and political crisis, as a result of which 2.5 million of our citizens have had to leave the country, and that amounts to more than 50% of the overall number of voters, and they are deprived of the right to vote and to be elected, which of course is true of our citizens who are still in the country as well. The civil society in Tajikistan has become a victim of terrible discrimination from the forces of law and order, combating the opposition, dealing with people who think otherwise, intimidation, threats, and pressure on activists. This has become the main work of the forces of law and order. Yes, please speak to the subject, but we are speaking to the subject.
Topic of the working session. Please continue.
Rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, civil society activists, opposition leaders, they're all labeled extremists and terrorists. And all of the financial resources, the grants that European countries are making available for the development. Yes, but we need to have people speak to the subject. But when the Russian Federation...
I will now return the floor to the speaker, encouraging the speaker to stick to the topic of our discussion today, which includes the democracy at the local, regional, and national level. If you could bring your contribution to the topic of a discussion and address the questions that we proposed as well. Thank you very much. Please continue.
All of the financial resources and the grants that European countries are making available for the development of democracy and strengthening democratic institutions in Tajikistan are in fact being used by the Rahman regime to put pressure on the media, to kidnap activists, and to kill opposition leaders. Dear colleagues, dear of the OSCE, I mean, this meeting is a high-level meeting, and it really should not be acceptable that a president of a participating state be labeled in these terms. It is a high-level meeting, and when we talk about democracy,
to exercise the right of reply and the end of the session. In the meanwhile, I return the floor to the speaker.
So, to make any recommendations here to the representatives of the Rahman regime is pointless. Rather, we appeal to representatives of Western countries. When you provide financial resources or other type of assistance to Tajikistan, you should put forward very rigid conditions concerning respect by the government of Tajikistan for democratic principles and human rights. And we also call on the participating states of the OSCE to put pressure on the Rahman regime to fulfill all international obligations that have been taken on in the field of human rights.
This is the Human Rights Commission. Excuse me. The next speaker on my list is the Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan, to be followed by the Russian Federation. Human Rights Commission of Kazakhstan, you have the floor. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to recommend the work of two unique human rights institutions, the democratic institutes in Kazakhstan. This is the experience of the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission on Human Rights is a platform for dialogue between the civil society and state bodies. The Commission is a place where many issues of human rights are being discussed, including updating the electoral laws of Kazakhstan. Out of the 43 members, over 17 are representatives of civil society. The expert council, which is made up of 45 people, are also representatives from civil society. At the Commission, we first tested the draft law elaborated by the Kazakhstan International Bureau on Human Rights with regard to the holding of meetings and public demonstrations in Kazakhstan. We also looked at defending the rights of people being repatriated, refugees, stateless people, as well as avoiding human trafficking in Kazakhstan. Other institutions and participating states of the OSCE can use this experience in their work. Ladies and gentlemen, because we don't have very much time, I'm going to go on to another institute. This is an advisory body on the human dimension in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan. It is also made up 80% of civil society participants. International officials are accredited by Kazakhstan. They're invited to our meetings. They discuss the very topical issues of the cooperation of Kazakhstani civil society with state bodies. They work together with the United Nations and also in improving our laws on human rights in Kazakhstan. We can provide you with all the details and also to provide this information to the Secretariat.
Спасибо. The next speaker on my list is the Russian Federation, to be followed by Armenia. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, the electoral system in the Russian Federation celebrated its 25th anniversary. Various elections have been held. We have improved our electoral legislation on the basis of ODIHR recommendations. We fulfill all of our OSCE obligations, in particular under the 1999 Copenhagen document, with invitation of international observers. The authorities of the Russian Federation also participate in electoral observation missions in other participating states. Now, despite our strong commitment to the OSCE principles, but that is not true of many other participating states. We criticize, we condemn the fact that there is not a possibility this year for observation of elections to the presidential and parliamentary elections in all parts of the territory of the Russian Federation, although they were carried out in accordance with international standards. So the Ukrainian authorities did not accept this, and when it comes to observation of Ukrainian elections, all we hear is certain statements of facts, and it's clear that ODIHR has once again shown itself to be politicized. For instance, as previously, we see a clear imbalance in the geographical composition of the members of observation missions, and continuing to do this is very much contrary to the way in which we are supposed to observe elections. I mean, the gold ODIHR standard is no longer a gold standard. There needs to be a transparent process for taking decisions with the participation of all participating states. And we certainly do insist that the system used to observe elections be changed, and that the principles of independence and impartiality be respected. The decision to send missions or not, yes, I've almost finished. There needs to be very clear criteria for the way in which elections are observed. We will submit a full text of our statement.
Armenia, to be followed by the National Center for Human Rights, Kazakhstan. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. After the massive peaceful assembly movement known as the Velvet Revolution, which occurred in Armenia in spring 2018, the new Armenian authorities assumed the responsibility of building a society with absolute respect of human rights and good governance. When the new government was voted in, empowered with the overwhelming support of the people, it embarked on the implementation of the reform agenda aimed at anchoring stable democratic institutions, the rule of law, protection and promotion of human rights and freedoms. Recognizing the vital importance of early parliamentary elections, the government prioritized the necessity of conducting democratic elections in compliance with international standards. In this regard, it is important to mention about respective amendments to the electoral and penal codes, which expanded the list of those prohibited from campaigning, lifted restrictions for media observers, and increased sanctions and penalties for electoral offenses, in line with previous OSCE ODIHR and Council of Europe's Venice Commission recommendations. As noted by different observation missions, including from the ODIHR, contestants were able to conduct their campaigns freely, and fundamental freedoms of association, assembly, expression, and movement were fully respected during the campaign. It is noteworthy that the first of its kind in Armenia live debate between the leaders of 11 political parties forces running for the snap parliamentary elections was held and hosted by the Armenian public television. Elections held on December 9, 2018 were generally assessed by local and international observers as free, fair, competitive, and transparent, and enjoyed broad public trust. It was the first time that election results had not been contested by any party. Mr. Moderator, the nationwide parliamentary elections were another important test for the Armenian society, which showed its ability and maturity to embrace the demands of democracy and human rights. They consolidated the democratic transformation of Armenia and accurately reflected the existing political landscape. And in conclusion, we would like to reaffirm the readiness and political will of the Armenian authorities to preserve the public confidence through ongoing and upcoming reforms, and in this regard look forward to further close cooperation with respective international organizations. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much. Before I pass the floor to the next speaker, I wanted to remind everybody that the session today is touching on both elections and democratic institutions and the democracy at local, regional, and national level. We have a guiding question that has to do with the ensuring independent and well-functioning democratic institutions, pluralism, strengthening accountability and transparency at all government levels. As the head of election department, I can speak for days about elections, but I want to cover the other side of the topic that we have on the discussion today as well. So I encourage the participants to address both topics of today's session, and once again reiterate the encouragement for providing concrete and specific recommendations. With this, I would like to pass the floor to the next speaker on my list. That's the National Center for Human Rights Kazakhstan, to be followed by Public Foundation Civic Platform. National Center for Human Rights Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Since the independence of Kazakhstan, we have had systemic work on elaborating human rights mechanisms. The Ombudsman of Human Rights institution was created in 2002. In 2014, it became a status B institution. In 2017, as part of the constitutionary reforms, the Ombudsman's institution is now part of our constitution. This shows the importance and significance of a country in our democratic reforms and support for fundamental rights and freedoms. The Ombudsman observes the rights for the most vulnerable people in the population, focuses on vulnerable children, combating exploitation, especially against exploitation of children, and also with regard to the prevention of torture and other forms of ill treatment. In 2014, a preventive mechanism was created under the Convention Against Torture. The coordinator of the Ombudsman's institution conducts monitoring in prisons. The Ombudsman Office also consistently works on raising awareness in society on these topics. We thank our partners from international organizations, OSCE, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as many other NGOs in Kazakhstan. We also work with many other important international NGOs. We have now conducted over many seminars that have elaborated many recommendations to the authorities. This work is consolidated in a report every year that is provided to NGOs as well as to the UN Committee on the Prevention of Torture.
During the agenda, we'll focus on the torture prevention and on the human rights monitoring in the places of detention. So I kindly ask you to bring your contribution closer to the topic of this session. Thank you.
In practice, we have seen that monitoring in prisons with the coordinating role of the Ombudsman and with civil society members helps to prevent abuse and to ensure human rights are respected. We also are elaborating an additional mechanism that with the support of other international organizations has helped us to elaborate the human rights institutions.
On my list is Public Foundation Civic Platform, to be followed by Karakalpakstan News Channel. Public Foundation Civic Platform, you have the floor.
Dear participants, good afternoon. A small country like the Kyrgyz Republic is striving to preserve at least a semblance of democracy in Central Asia with the assistance of organizations like the OSCE's ODIHR, which is really having a big influence through its recommendations on the legislation that we adopt. But we would also like to stress the role of civil society in the whole process of discussing how elections need to be organized in our country. But on the eve of elections, there is a period in which the authorities are trying to put in place conditions for control of the civil society sector, doing this in particular through control of the financing of the private sector and activists and election observers in order to have an influence on the elections by controlling the monitoring and making it difficult objectively to assess the elections. But this situation is arising not only because the authorities are introducing these mechanisms, but also because there's an absence of a plurality of views in our parliament. We are a parliamentary democracy, but there isn't a real presence of opposition politicians in the parliament. And that is why it is possible for such legislative initiatives to get through. Now, of course, your recommendations and the recommendations of other international organizations play a very significant role, and they do serve to strengthen the administrative resources available to ensure that elections take place, but perhaps some new mechanisms could be put in place in order to improve the system further. Here I would like to stress the important role to be played by the development of political parties as such. As you know, having political parties that enjoy the confidence of citizens is important, not just for the Central Asian region, but for the OSCE area as a whole. And in this respect, we would like to see some influence brought to bear on the process of monitoring to make sure that observers are present and are fully independent and impartial. Thank you.
The next speaker on my list is the Karakalpakstan News Channel, to be followed by European Youth of Ukraine. Karakalpakstan News Channel, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте.
Good afternoon. Now, if I tell you that in Karakalpakstan there is no freedom of media or of opinion or of expression, you might ask, how is this possible? Well, the government of Uzbekistan not only denies freedom of expression in Karakalpakstan, but they also rigidly repress all of those who try to ask for political freedoms, who criticize the government and who express their opinions in the social sphere. If they do that, they are denied exit from the country.
Contribution closer to the topic of this working session. Was this Uzbekistan? I understand you have the point of order.
That was my point of order.
I kindly ask the speaker to bring the topic of the contribution closer in line with the thematic session. Thank you.
Продолжать. Правительство Узбекистана.
The government of Uzbekistan is making it impossible for people who are in opposition to leave the country. And I can mention a whole series of rights defenders like Kurbanov and others who have not been able to leave the country.
Theme of the session, please.
I do see how the discussion of the possible political disagreements in the country can be related to the topic of this discussion. I kindly ask the speaker to continue. Я попрошу вас придерживаться.
But please do stick to the theme of this particular session. You may now continue, but I would ask you to bring your statement closer to the theme of this session. The residents of the Republic of Karakalpakstan never confirmed through a referendum the need for them to have Uzbek passports. It's the dictator Karimov who insisted that we have these passports, and now residents can't go abroad even for medical care. And this is a crime against humanity. Niyet Turmayev and Berdi Muratov were detained at the Sheremetyevo airport in Moscow on their way to come here. They were kept back by the state security forces of Russia. So they are not present today. And this means that the Russian authorities are also against the independence and democracy in Karakalpakstan. So how can the peace-loving citizens and residents of Karakalpakstan confront Russia and Uzbekistan with their military right? So please contribute to ensuring freedom of expression in Karakalpakstan.
Just to stick closely to the thematic topic of this session. Was this, I would like to pass the floor to the next speaker on my list, that is European Youth of Ukraine, to be followed by Uzbekistan. European Youth of Ukraine, you have the floor.
Good evening. I want to talk about the democracy in Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine. You know that the war here lasts for 5 years. So we have some problems with democracy. First of all, Crimea and part of the territories in Lugansk and Donetsk region are occupied by Russia. That means that we can't hold elections there. Nowadays, we discuss the possibilities, and the voices from different people are very different. So the negotiation process recently acquired a new impetus. Ukraine is actively discussing the possibility of elections in the occupied territories. We hope the civilized world realizes that such elections can only be conducted in accordance with Ukrainian law and international standards, without the threat of violence and fear for voters and observers, without mass Russian propaganda, and only if there will be enough sources of information open to the public. The transitional justice system should be organized there before the elections. The courts and the media must function. Independent candidates must have the possibility to campaign in democratic conditions. This is possibly only one way how the elections there could be named by the word elections. Also, we want to talk that the problem is that Russia hold Russian elections on Ukrainian territories, in Crimea, for example. It shouldn't be like that. Secondly, a more specific challenge is connected with possible local elections in the controlled areas near the front line with the occupied Donbass. Ukraine had the contradictory experience of organizing the pre-term parliamentary election in 2019, including the majoritarian districts near the front line. The population of these territories depend on the military situation as well as on the checkpoint regime in the pre-electoral period and on the voting day. Moreover, those zones are fully covered by the TV and radio propaganda broadcasting organized by Russian forces from the occupied territories. What is more, OSCE, SMM in Ukraine did not pay special attention to this conflict-related electoral proceeding. Thus, now the practical discussion may be not about the virtual possibility of democratic local elections in occupied Donbass regarding the political program of the Minsk Agreement. However, discussions must be started immediately regarding the essential duty of organizing the local elections in the decentralized territorial units of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions controlled by the Ukrainian authorities in 2020.
I kindly ask you to conclude.
We have several more problems on controlled territory.
As I mentioned earlier, you can submit the full text of your statement to the documents distribution.
Just two more problems is the decentralization process, which started in 2016 and still it's not finished. So we have united territories communities, but not so many people in Ukraine.
We have to conclude. We have to stick to the time limits if we want to finish the session in time. Thank you very much. The next speaker on my list is Uzbekistan, to be followed by Georgia. Uzbekistan, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, today on Uzbekistan's political agenda, there's a very important event. Namely, in December, we will have elections to the parliament and to local representative bodies. It should be noted that the preparation for the elections are taking place in an atmosphere of deepening of the process of democratization, with strengthening of civil society institutions and also modernization of the electoral system of the country, in particular on the basis of recommendations of an ODIHR mission. Now, over the last while, Uzbekistan has already implemented many of these recommendations. First and foremost, the unification of the electoral legislation with a single electoral code, introduction of a single computerized list of voters. There are a number of other measures as well. With a view to holding these elections at the highest possible democratic level, a lot of preparatory work is being done, given that our country is prepared to hold this important democratic process openly and transparently in accordance with international organization. The Central Electoral Commission has invited ODIHR to assess the level of preparation. Now, there has been a positive assessment by ODIHR of the preparatory work that has been done and has expressed its intention to send a fully fledged observation mission. Now, the elections will take place under a renewed and reformed electoral code, and we have followed a number of recommendations, such as doing away with certain quotas that were in place, making sure that there is full access to voting stations for all individuals, and we're doing all of this in accordance with the recommendations of ODIHR and the Venice Commission. There are some other critical comments that have been made, but we already have a working party that is studying them very carefully, and some proposals will be prepared. We, of course, have our own position of principle on the basis of many years of experience in holding elections. And when the ODIHR mission arrives, we will discuss the situation with them, but we are certainly prepared to take into consideration all recommendations that could make it possible for voters freely to express their will, because that is in the interest of our society and our nation.
Georgia, to be followed by Switzerland. Georgia, you have the floor.
It's my privilege to address you on behalf of Central Election Commission of Georgia, CC Georgia, and welcome the participants of 2019 Human Dimension Implementation Meeting. The election administration regularly examines the OSCE recommendations, and after each general elections makes proposals to amend the election code and implement the recommendations. The CC also established new platforms to improve cooperation with key electoral stakeholders in responding to ODIHR recommendations. Recently, CC launched a new platform, Discuss Together, and one of the main aims is to discuss OSCE ODIHR recommendations. The platform, together with CSOs, will prompt discussions and support analyzing election issues, contributing to creating a common vision on election matters. Notably, reports of international organizations and public opinion polls indicate the positive assessment of election administration's performance, which is a good source for measuring our achievement. Of course, there are challenges that we respond to with improved work and the introduction of good practices after each election. We, together with other electoral stakeholders, are the members of the Electoral Reform Group established by the Parliament of Georgia, which strives to address OSCE ODIHR recommendations in the legislation. It is planned to shift from the mixed electoral system into proportional by 2020 parliamentary elections, which will be of great importance for the democratic development of our country. Constitutional amendments are being prepared and public discussions are being held already in this regard. We, together with other key electoral stakeholders, are ready to continue addressing OSCE ODIHR recommendations to bring election processes into compliance with the international standards, boost democratic process, and serve as a role model in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Switzerland, to be followed by Human Rights Alliance of Karakalpakstan. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Besten Dank, Herr Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. At the outset, I would like to thank ODIHR for their tireless professional efforts in the name of strengthening democratic institutes in the OSCE area. Especially, I would like to mention the methodology on election observation approved by ODIHR, which is unfair, transparent, and objective. In 2019, we will have parliamentary elections in Switzerland. Now, ODIHR has presented very useful recommendations in their observation report, which we will use wisely. Switzerland is convinced that democratic institutions are the foundation for successful societies and guarantee sustainable economic development. This is why we have 3 recommendations. Firstly, elections at all levels be equally democratic. This means that important international standards and OSCE commitments must also be implemented when we're talking about local elections. There are opportunities to invite ODIHR as electoral observers for local elections as well. For example, this is topical when we talk about large cities, where sometimes are larger than certain OSCE participating states. Secondly, participating states of the OSCE must, to a greater extent, request ODIHR assessments when considering new laws, especially in the area of electoral laws. There are ODIHR's legal conclusions that will help countries bring their laws in line with international standards. Thirdly, it is necessary to strengthen internal and foreign policies, international laws, and standards must be included, and to discuss the discussions of HDM have a direct effect on people's lives. In this respect, participating states and civil society must play their role. Thank you very much.
Danke. The next speaker on my list is the Human Rights Alliance of Karakalpakstan, to be followed by Tajikistan. The Human Rights Alliance of Karakalpakstan, you have the floor.
In August of 2018, over 100 people were arrested on the eve of the national protest in Karakalpakstan. People were tortured and raped. They did not have access to lawyers or their families. With me, Erman Iskandarov was beaten and also tortured for 4 days. The security services of Uzbekistan threatened them. This is what we have in Karakalpakstan when people demand democratic reforms. I was under house arrest for 8 months. For 27 days, I could not leave the house. I ran away and crossed the border and was hiding for 3 months in Kazakhstan in order to be able to come here. This is what we see in Karakalpakstan. It is fascism. This is what happens when people demand reforms. They risk their lives. And today,
I kindly ask the speaker to bring the topic of the contribution closer in line with the thematic session. Thank you.
How can we have democratic elections in Karakalpakstan if all civil society associations are banned by the government of Uzbekistan and the governmental organs in Karakalpakstan are appointed personally by Mirziyoyev? We request that the conference participants should help the people of Karakalpakstan to rebuild our democratic institutes and to lead our people out from Uzbek occupation. We would like to invite participants on the 26th of September to the plenary hall at 4:15 when we will present a detailed report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Tajikistan, to be followed by Public Fund Wings of Liberty. Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. After the elections in 2015, the Parliament of the Republic of Tajikistan received some recommendations from ODIHR, and on the basis of those recommendations, we changed our legislation. We, in fact, implemented most of the recommendations, which has made it possible for us to ensure free and fair elections in the country. In particular, we've strengthened the powers of the Central Electoral Commission and the local commissions. We've adopted a law on the elections and on the commission, which has greater powers and prerogatives. Members of the commission will be appointed on an independent and permanent basis, and that commission will include representatives of political parties who will have consultative status before the commission. Now, thanks to the presence of national and international observers, the elections will no doubt unfold peacefully, and they will be fully free, fair, and transparent. Next year in Tajikistan, we will have elections for both the presidency and the parliament, and I would like to invite ODIHR and other international organizations and also participating states of the OSCE to send observers on the occasion of those elections. I can see I have a few seconds left, so maybe I can respond to some of the slanderous statements that have been made about Tajikistan. I don't think there's a statement that there's no political parties in Tajikistan. Well, we have 7 of them. 3 of them have seats in the parliament, And there are therefore 3 political fractions in the parliament of Tajikistan, and those organizations like Group 24 are recognized as extremist terrorist organizations in the country. And therefore, I think that we should reject the slanderous statements to the effect that we have a Führer or something along those lines. That really is not quite acceptable. We are a fully fledged member of the OSCE, and we believe that this is a meeting for civilized individuals.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is the Public Fund Wings of Liberty, to be followed by Azerbaijan. Public Fund Wings of Liberty, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants of the conference, ladies and gentlemen. In 2019 became a year that presents many challenges to the civil society of Kazakhstan, and also the renaming of the capital in honor of the first president. Their internet was blocked, activists were detained, as social networks were blocked. On the 9th of June, the presidential elections took place. It was the first elections that took place where there was a focus on people with disabilities, where people who were visually impaired could also take place. But for us, these were also elections that presented the most violations since the observation started 10 years ago. Also, the members of the electoral commissions locally were not well prepared. There was no freedom for people to move around at polling stations. In Almaty, there were people who hauled observers into certain districts. They were cordoned off by a red rope. Also, I wanted to note that people were detained and arrested amongst activists and observers. At the polling stations in the capital, for example, during the voting, our independent observers were detained. The internet connections were cut off. This is something we suffered all year long, but during the day of elections, we could not really work if we did not have access to the internet and did not have VPN. There were various other breaches. For example, people were on electoral lists that had no right to be registered there. In Shipkent, in the city of Aktau, when ballots were being counted, they turned off the lights, for example. There also, in certain polling stations in various cities, there were instances where after the ballots were counted, the members of the Electoral Commission did not post the results and would basically run away with the results. In 2020, we will have parliamentary elections in Kazakhstan, and we see that the citizens' rights to be elected to the local authorities will be violated. I appeal to participating states to focus more at the upcoming parliamentary elections in Kazakhstan and to attract international observers to our country. Thank you.
The speaker on my list is Azerbaijan, to be followed by Public Association Open Dialogue. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to underline that legal reforms of protection and promotion of human rights in Azerbaijan as a secular, democratic and legal state are underway. In recent years, human rights reforms in Azerbaijan have become more profound. Very significant legal norms, national action program and strategies have been adopted. Those norms established an effective protection of the rights of marginalized group and facilitate the development of human rights situation. For example, new law on the rights of persons with disabilities regulated the basis of state policy for persons with disabilities and identified state obligation on protection of their rights. Another important legal norms in the law on employment, which identifies legal, economic, and institutional basis and state social security issues of the employment and those who are seeking job. Azerbaijan also focused on the protection of child rights, health development as issues of state priorities. In terms of ensuring the age-appropriate information for children, the law on protection of children from harmful information, dated October 2018, regulated the protective measures of children from harmful information and the relation emerging in this context. In recent years, one of the important laws adopted in relation to the effective protection of human rights is the law on mediation. This law regulated the public relation emerging in organization of mediation as one of the alternatives to dispute resolutions and established purpose, principles, rules to implement and the status of mediators. I would like to note that Commissioner of Azerbaijan also closely participated in the drafting process of the aforementioned legislative norms regarding what the Ombudsman also put forward her proposal, which have been also taken into consideration. As a result of state policy and institutional public administration reforms made in Azerbaijan in last years, it has been created Asan Service and the DOST agency as a national trends which facilitate transparent activity of state bodies, increasing citizen satisfaction and welfare of people. And finally, I would like to say that today Asan Service and DOST agency in Azerbaijan equals to a citizen satisfaction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking to the time limit. The next speaker on my list is the Public Association Open Dialogue, to be followed by Freedom House. Public Association Open Dialogue, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Recently, the change in the political leadership in Kazakhstan has brought some hope that there would be more respect for human rights. The rhetoric was right, but the reality was quite different. The current authorities are really not in a position to respect the right of citizens to participate in the governing of the country. Now, my NGO seeks to ensure the right to vote and to make sure that electoral campaigns are genuine. But it can be seen from the presidential elections that there really is not the case. I mean, there have been hundreds of cases brought charging violation of the electoral law. Citizens are prepared to be very active in the civil society, but that is not used positively by the authorities. Every level of administrative power introduces its own negative influence, reducing the transparency of the political process and the electoral process. And with the inability of the state to follow established standards, the democratic elections really end up being something of a sham. And so we would call upon the initiation of a process that would introduce electronic voting in the country. And we also call upon international institutions and our colleagues in the country to cooperate together to introduce modern platforms. Doing away with the majority system has made it very difficult for independent rights activists to have access to the political process. The political parties are closed, hermetic structures, and they are the ones who decide who is going to be on the electoral lists. And it's almost impossible to create a new political party. But let us nevertheless praise what is worth being praised. The authorities do seem to be prepared to engage in dialogue with civil society, but the over-bureaucratization of the political process is killing civil society dialogue.
Gleiche Möglichkeiten für alle. Freedom House, you have the floor.
Moderator, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Freedom House condemns the systemic, illegal, and violent crackdown on the freedom of assembly taking place before our eyes around the recent municipal elections in the Russian Federation. The violent and unlawful response by the authorities targeting independent candidates who attempted to run for the Moscow City Duma and their supporters demonstrates a blatant assault on the already precarious democratic institutions in Russia and the ability of individuals to collectively, peacefully voice their concerns. Dozens of independent candidates fulfilled the requirements to register their candidacy in the September 8th Moscow City Duma elections, with each candidate gathering at least 4,500 verifiable signatures from supporters in their district. Regardless, the Moscow Election Commission nullified the signatures of thousands of Muscovites and removed around 30 opposition candidates from appearing on the ballot, sparking mass outrage, including among those who had verified their signatures. Demanding justice, people took to the streets starting July 14th. On August 10th, nearly 60,000 people marched in support of the removed candidates. Russian authorities responded by arresting over 1,100 protesters at the July rally alone. Furthermore, Russian authorities illegally detained a number of prominent independent candidates, such as Ilya Yashin, who was jailed for 42 days, 12 days in excess of the maximum allowed detention period under Russian criminal procedural rules. Freedom House urges OSCE institutions and participating states to hold the Russian government responsible for its systemic crackdown on peaceful candidates, jailing of protesters and independent candidates, and the blatant violation of Russian citizens' right to peacefully assembly and free speech. Freedom House calls on the Russian government to immediately release and exonerate a list of people who were hastily convicted to years of imprisonment without due process. The full list of individuals we believe must be released and not prosecuted can be found in the full text of our statement. Publicly condemn and hold the members of the police and National Guard responsible who are guilty of using excessive violence against peaceful protesters. Respect the right of Russian citizens to nominate their representatives to run for elected office and ensure equal access to the ballot for all eligible candidates. Implement all ODIHR recommendations in organizing and conducting free and fair elections in accordance to OSCE standards. And lastly, invite OSCE short-term and long-term observers to monitor elections, not only national, but also regional and local elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the spot-on sticking to the time limits. The next speaker on my list is the Bewegung Gleiche Möglichkeiten für Allen, to be followed by the Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety. Please, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, distinguished colleagues, I am from Equal Opportunities for All Association. For 30 years now, the official authorities of Uzbekistan have waged war on the civil sector, on opposition leaders. This war continues. Even today, it's a 24-hour-day war and 365 days a year. For citizens of Tajikistan do not have the opportunity to run for office, in spite of the fact that the representative of Tajikistan just said that they have created all the conditions necessary for elections. In fact, each deputy from local authorities all the way up to the Senate or Parliament has to get the approval of the Uzbek Special Services. The Special Services of Uzbekistan approve deputies or candidates. This is the country that has the cruelest and strictest procedures for registering political parties. To register a political party, you need to gather 20,000 signatures. Even if you do have them, you still cannot register the party because in Uzbekistan there are no opposition political parties. Those parties that are abroad are also persecuted. And if they can, they liquidate them, they eliminate them. Last year in February, the opposition movement in Berdanlik decided to hold a conference in the south of Kazakhstan in order to give them the right to be an opposition political party. But in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, they held a joint operation and stopped this conference from going forward. And it turned into an online conference instead. This is why I would like to appeal to the international community to make sure that you look very carefully at the information provided by the Tajik authorities. They lie. Their main aim is to have total control over the civil society. Thank you.
On my list is the Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, to be followed by Civil Holding Group of Influence. Institute for Reporters' Freedom and Safety, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator, for giving me the floor. My name is Husseinov, and I'm a human rights defender and a journalist in Azerbaijan. In December, we'll be having municipal elections in the country, and we expect this to take place in a somber atmosphere of impunity, because neither the OSCE nor the Council of Europe generally send observers to our country for local elections. And we're very worried that democracy at the local level will fall below the already low previous standards. Over the last 5 years, civil society is in a very difficult situation. There are all sorts of charges against us, non-payment of taxes, money laundering, financial shenanigans.
Again, my friend, I think he is just getting to another topic. We need to remind him. He's talking about just some journalism or mass media, but it's election and it's
I understand that
freedom of expression.
it has
one
been.
part
Excuse
of the
me. I understand it has been touching on the freedom of expression, but I also see the relevance of the topic. I still ask the representative to the speaker to address the topics of this thematic session more explicitly.
Свобода слова как
Well, freedom of expression is absolutely necessary for free and fair elections, and it's in a very dire straits with the fact that international organizations will not be observing the local elections, and given that we don't have the resources, the authorities prevent us from obtaining resources from abroad. So we would appeal to OSCE participating states to support Azerbaijani civil society and to send observers to make sure that those local elections are in fact strictly observed. Insofar as democratic institutions are concerned, in 2020 we will have parliamentary elections, so the current local elections are a bit of a preparation for that, but we have the same people in power for more than 20 years. The current president, the son of the previous one, and his wife is the vice president.
Azerbaijan.
Sorry, I would encourage the gentleman to speak on the topic, please.
I return the floor to the speaker. I do see the relevance of the points he is making to the topic under discussion. Please, you can continue.
правящие элиты
Now, there is no accountability to the population. Natural resources are being taken advantage of. The President of the Republic spends millions of dollars on the luxurious needs of his own family rather than taking care of the needs of the population.
Spirit. This is not regarding the budgetary issues or something, or about the state budget of Azerbaijan.
I see the point you're making. The issue of accountability is explicitly mentioned in the thematic session. Still, you have literally 2 seconds to conclude your remarks, and then we will have to be moving on. Please, you have literally 2 seconds to conclude.
The president and his son spend millions of dollars without any accountability, and the president does not adopt any measures in favor of the population. So we would appeal to the international community to take measures and, in fact, to introduce sanctions against the corrupt regime.
Is Civil Holding Group of Influence to be followed by Civil Network Opora? Civil Holding Group of Influence, you have the floor.
Hello, my name is Natalia Novikova, NGO Group of Influence, Ukraine. We are working over the IDP's election rights issues over 4 years. And this year, presidential and parliamentary elections were held in Ukraine. Unfortunately, more than 1 million Ukrainian citizens who are internally displaced persons were not able to participate in the elections because of the legislative gaps. In Ukraine, the electoral address is tied to the registration of the citizen's place of residence, which in turn often indicates ownership to the property at the address. Millions of Ukrainians, including IDPs, students, and labor migrants, do not live at their official registration address. In order to vote in presidential and parliamentary elections at the place of factual residence, citizens must temporarily change their voting place without changing their electoral address. This procedure is not transferable. For each election, a new application is required. So citizens had to undergo this procedure twice within a few weeks in the case of a two-round election, as it was, for example, in the last presidential election. Taking into account high concentration of IDPs and labor migrants in big cities, this procedure took hours or even days in queues. It is extremely difficult for residents of the temporarily occupied territories in Crimea and Donbass because it's impossible to apply online, or it has to be done only in place where a person wants to vote. So the number of changing the vote in place is quite low. It's only 1% at the president election and even less in the parliament election. And I would like to emphasize that it is the only way to participate in elections for IDPs. And IDPs have been living in their new communities for up to 5 years, and they pay taxes, but unfortunately they cannot vote in local elections as law doesn't consider them members of the communities. Well, if the legislation is not changed within a few months, the next local elections, currently scheduled for October 2020, could again pass without participation of 1.2 million citizens who live in these communities. And given the above, we recommend the Parliament of Ukraine should amend the legislation to remove all barriers that prevent IDPs from taking part in all elections at their factual address. And IDPs and other mobile citizens should be able to register electoral address without changing residence registration address based on the procedure elaborated in draft law 6240. And we hope that electoral code vetoed by the president of Ukraine several days ago will include in new version mechanism protecting electoral rights of IDP, especially in advance of the next local elections. Thank you.
Thank you. I now will pass the floor to Civil Network Opora, to be followed up by Wake Up Karakal Pakistan. Civil Network Opora, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, dear moderator and participants. I want to focus on two challenges which are very important for free and fair elections in Ukraine. First of all, it's independent electoral bodies and the real progress with electoral law reform. 4 days ago, Ukrainian parliament implemented a political agreement on early dissolution of the CEC. On the eve of this vote, Opora stated that there is no sound basis for the President and Parliament to apply Article 31 of the law of Ukraine of the CEC, which provided the possibility to dissolve the entire CEC. President claims concerning inaction of the CEC do not contain direct evidence that the CEC violated voting rights of citizens and as interpreted by the legislation of Ukraine. We want to emphasize that the politically motivated resolution of the CEC members is against the International Electoral Administration standards and Ukrainian legislation establishing 7 years term of office for CEC members. While there are legal possibility to early dissolve the CEC, its political independence and stability are in question. Now Parliament and President have to ensure a transparent and inclusive nomination of candidates from all political groups and fractions on the basis of proportional equality and to improve legislation regulating the CEC. We hope that there is a big chance to adopt electoral code at the same time with amendments from civil society which provide recommendation of international and local independent observation missions about electoral system, protection electoral rights of IDPs, mobile groups inside the country, gender quota, people with disabilities, transparent and accountable political finance, regulation of agitation, especially in social media and internet. Verkhovna Rada has to consider and adopt the draft law of providing the proportional nature of punishment for electoral crimes or frauds in order to change the capacity of prevent and investigate electoral fraud. And one more thing, Russia is the aggressor state which occupied Ukrainian territories in Crimea and Donbass. This fact is again the obligation of participant countries of OSCE. This fact is the reason why Russian citizens didn't have a chance to observe Ukrainian election. Thank you.
Thank you. We will be moving on. The next speaker on my list is Wake Up Karakal Pakistan. We are exactly at 2/3 of the speakers list. I want to use the opportunity following the statements focusing primarily on elections. I want to remind that the topics of this session also cover the functioning of parliaments, the separation of powers, transparency and accountability of state authorities, and I want to once again call on the participants to focus on those areas as well. Even though, as I said before, I could be myself talking about elections for days on end, but we do have other topics to focus on and consider as well. With this, I pass the floor to Wake Up Karakalpakstan, to be followed by Citizen Research and Development Public Union. Please, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте,
Dear colleagues, thank you. I mean, no one can doubt today that the repressive regime of Shavkat Mirziyoyev is violating human rights in the Republic of Karakalpakstan with a view to taking control of the natural resources and the territory of the Republic of Karakalpakstan. Let me show you how the government of Uzbekistan is assassinating, is killing, yes, killing the people of Karakalpakstan and using a weapon of mass destruction, in fact, to do this. In this bottle, you will see some water, which is that weapon of mass destruction. This is water that we all drink in Karakalpakstan, and this water contains heavy metals, chemical pollution, pesticides, herbicides. Various salts and minerals in amounts 1,000 times higher than the admissible levels.
And to the second dimension of the security, but I kindly ask you to bring your contribution closer in line with the topic of this session, and you may continue.
So this is the poisoned water that results in stomach ailments, kidney failure, liver problems, cancers, mental illness, and heart disease. So all of this is resulting in the premature death of the citizens of Karakalpakstan. So imagine that it's very hot outside, 45 degrees centigrade. The government of Uzbekistan switches off the electricity, the gas network.
I want to ask you to bring your contribution closer in line with the topic of this session. Thank you.
And yet there are no filters to clean the water. So the government of Uzbekistan simply forces us to drink this water. We have no choice. How otherwise can we slake our thirst? So Shavkat Mirziyoyev, in forcing us to drink this poisoned water, is causing millions of persons in Karakalpakstan to suffer health problems every year and hundreds of thousands of them to die. Is this not a form of genocide? We've calculated that just $3 million US would suffice to provide the entire population with water filters.
And you mentioned that twice our speaker went to other dimension of OSCE, so if you could please ask him to keep to the theme of this session, please.
I hear your point of order. I have to agree. I did see a potential of bringing the contribution closer in line with the thematic session, the topic of this session, but I think we will need to be moving on, and I will pass now the floor to Citizen Research and Development Public Union, to be followed by Kazimov, freelance journalist. Citizen Research and Development Public Union, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Günel Safarova. I was short-term observer in ODIHR election mission in Turkey and Ukraine, and I have seen that this mission is very important for democratic improvement. And I hope ODIHR will continue its mission and will observe parliament elections for next year in Azerbaijan too. One of the basic democratic values represents civil societies and citizens which are actively involved in all areas of political and social activities. But unfortunately, Azerbaijan's civil society faces darkest days since the country's independence. In 2014, changes and amendments made to the law of grants the law on state registration. They introduced many obligations for NGOs, including international and new registrations. International NGOs unfortunately left Azerbaijan due to the legal requirements from Minister of Justice and Minister of Finance. Civil society organizations need to inform and get official approval from an executive authorities about their events in the region. And still in Azerbaijan, there is investigation of civil society representatives. For example, I was invited to court and anti-corruption department to investigate the service contract between me and between German Marshall Foundation. I would like to thank US government for extremely important role in Azerbaijan in a field of democracy, election, youth activities. Azerbaijan is playing critical role countering Russian and Iranian influence. So I urge all decision-making organizations, individuals, to consider for future support to civil societies and to government to minimize Kremlin's influence to democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to Kazimov, freelance journalist, to be followed by Tajik Center for Human Rights. Kazimov, freelance journalist, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. A free media environment is essential for democratic elections. It's necessary to create this environment in Azerbaijan. Traditional broadcast media are fully controlled by the government, and there is no way for alternative thinking on TV and radio. Therefore, I want to give concrete recommendations. In fact, these suggestions are well known, but there is some benefit in repetition. Recommendation number 1. Liquidation of state-run media. Still, state TV and state-based newspapers exist in Azerbaijan. 2. Reestablishment public TV. Current public TV has not met expectation of nation. 3. Lobby or advocacy for implementation of the information law and decriminalization of defamation. 5. Promote ethics and self-regulation. 6. Legal framework for broadcast. Simplification of broadcast licensing. 7. Improve coordination among media, civil society, and government, and improve dialogue between government and media watchdogs. 8. Development of alternative media and multi-platform reporting. Media freedom and pluralism are at the heart of any democracy. The essential role of a free press not only as a conveyor of reliable and accurate news, but as a pillar of democracy. There is no democracy without a truly free press. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now will pass the floor to the Tajik Center for Human Rights, to be followed by Regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy of the Republic of Crimea, named after Paisi Hilendarsky. Tajik Center for Human Rights, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Unfortunately, here the Tajik delegation is involved in spreading lies since Emil Rahmon came to power in 1982 in Tajikistan. There have never been free elections. The National Parliament and all parliamentary deputies are selected by decision of Mr. Rahmon himself. In Dushanbe, a list of desired candidates is taking place, which are openly called the candidates of the president, which guarantees them full support of the local authorities and electoral bodies during the elections. And of course, they are guaranteed victory. In all these years, during these unfair elections, the electoral commissions at all levels have developed an entire system of falsifying the results of elections. And then a parliament is chosen, which is subordinated, which never goes against the will of the president who single-handedly rules the country. This president has been in power for 27 years and is continuing to hold on to his post forever. Rahmon justifies his illegal power over the oppressed people by many decisions and by amending laws. Now, after the amendments to the Constitution and its additions in May of 2016, there's no need to hold presidential elections at all, since a few months before the referendum, a law was passed that means that today the president can have no limits to rerun for president, and even if he resigns voluntarily, he will retain the right to meddle in the political life of the country, to issue decrees, to draft laws, in other words, to continue to indirectly rule the country. And all of these were set down during the Constitution reform. Now, this fully ignores that people may have any kind of right to elect and be elected. There are no free elections. How can this be when Rahmon remains president for life and when the only change of power will be down to his successors or people who inherit the power? And when we talk about any kind of fair elections, when anyone talks about this, it becomes both sad and ridiculous. Today we see that 9 million people have their rights violated.
Well, you are out of time anyways, but I would like to hear the point of order from Tajikistan.
We want to find out this person, on whose behalf is he speaking?
On my list, the representative is speaking on behalf of the Tajik Center for Human Rights.
That is correct.
Unfortunately, you are out of time. We'll allow a couple of more sentences, and then we will have to move moving on.
Fine. This is why only one recommendation is important: to call to all countries of the world not to give any humanitarian assistance or investments in Tajikistan while the government will not stop their opposition and their support for Rahmon. Thank you.
This is Regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy of the Republic of Crimea, named after Paisi Hilendarsky.
I have the point of order, Mr. Moderator.
And I do see a point of order from Ukraine. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. Bulgarians, together with other national minorities and indigenous people of Ukraine, enjoy fully their rights and fundamental freedom as the citizens of my country. However, we condemn the yet again provocative attempt of the Russian Federation to use the HDM for legitimization of the illegal occupation of Ukraine's Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol by bringing here the representatives of the entity that was registered by the specific law of the Russian Federation by the occupation authorities, namely the Federal Law on National Cultural Autonomies. As the Russian Federation is recognized by the UN as the occupying power in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol, the application of its legislation in the occupied territory contravenes international humanitarian law.
I can remind the distinguished representative of Ukraine that you will be able to use your right of reply.
It's not a right of reply. It's a point of order on the registration of such entity, referring to the point of order of the general conduct of the meeting we made during the previous working session, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much for making the procedural point. I can say that the participation in the Human Dimension meetings is subject to self-registration. The participants bear the responsibility for the accuracy and content of the information they submit during the self-registration. The registration does not imply any endorsement by the OSCE ODIHR of the names or status shown on this list and is without prejudice to OSCE decisions and commitments. I see another point of order, please, Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Moderator. I'd like to take advantage of our right of reply. Sorry, not right of reply, but rather to make a point of order. In responding to our Ukrainian colleague, we would like to appeal to all those who want to lodge points of order that when such issues are raised, well, we will always be responding in kind.
The first time I see the point of order to the point of order, but And with this, I will pass the floor to the speaker. Oh, I see another point of order. Please.
Mr. Moderator, once again, we have to make a comment with regard to the previous speaker. It was Mr. Ikhon Akubov. In your list, he is a member of the Association of Central Asian Migrants. Is anyone controlling these lists and the lists of speakers? Thank you.
No, the people taking the floor personally, so I do not know what the actual name of a person speaking is. What I have on my list is the name of the organization, and that is what I announced.
But somebody needs to keep an eye on the list to see who's speaking.
I do see the point you're making. I think we will be getting back to you, but all I see on my list is the name of the organization that the person has been representing when speaking. Whether that corresponds to how the person is registered, I will have to ask my colleagues about that. In the meanwhile, also bearing in mind that we do want to conclude by 6 o'clock today, I will be passing the floor on.
I apologize, but your answer does not convince us.
Let me tell you once again that I do not know the people taking the floor personally, and I do not see the badge from here, and I cannot know what the person's name is and what it says on the badge. I will be asking my colleagues to clarify this for me. In the meanwhile, if you allow, I would like to pass the floor to the next speaker, to be followed by Golos Movement.
So I can register myself on the list as any kind of organization and then to take the floor and then no one will stop me? Is that the way things work?
Your point. I will be asking my colleagues for clarifications on this. We will be getting back to you, but in order to continue with our proceedings, I am now passing the floor to the next speaker, to be followed by Golos Movement. The next speaker, you have the floor. The next speaker is the representative of Regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy of the Republic of Crimea, named after Paisi Hilandarsky. Please. I do not see the representative taking the floor. Therefore, I'm passing the floor on to Golos Movement. Please, Golos Movement, you will be followed by Ukraine. Golos, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the floor. Mr. Moderator, 1.5 years ago, on the basis of the results of the presidential elections in the Russian Federation, ODIHR published a number of recommendations with which we fully agree. The primary recommendations were put on the table, but just a week ago there were local elections with half of the voters participating. And I think that this is a good opportunity to summarize where we stand when it comes to implementing the recommendations of ODIHR. Now, the first and the most important recommendation was to pay particular attention to fundamental freedoms, freedom of assembly and freedom of expression of opinion. Now, many speakers have told us how this looks, in fact, in the Russian Federation, and thank you in particular to Freedom House for telling us what happened to those people who demonstrated peacefully in favor of unregistered candidates. There is, in fact, pressure on ordinary citizens and especially civil society activists in the Russian Federation. And I would draw your attention to the fact that the protests were incited by the fact that participants were not registered, even though a year and a half ago ODIHR said that registration of candidates should be simplified. At the present time, we have thousands of people who are under proceedings, who have been slapped with fines, or who are in prison. Just yesterday, an actor who was just standing at the metro and wasn't really demonstrating found himself fined as well. A number of candidates have been kept away from public discussion by being detained. And there have been seizures of the offices of a number of NGOs, including our Golos movement, Saratov and elsewhere, in Moscow. A member of our council has his liberty restrained. Another member of our council is being detained. So this, yes, I'm coming to a close. So this really undermines the whole electoral process, and I would appeal to the Russian Federation, to the Central Electoral Commission, a member of which, a representative of which is present, to take seriously the recommendations of ODIHR. Otherwise, the Russian Federation will find itself in a severe and deep political crisis.
As the floor, I want to, well, first of all, it was quite peculiar that we had an exchange of point of orders and then the speaker never took the floor. But on the point of order raised by Tajikistan, we cannot check right now physically who exactly was speaking. My memory is not photographic. We will be looking at the footage and we will be looking into the issue. With this, I'm passing the floor to Ukraine, to be followed by Azerbaijan Press Council. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. The Charter of Paris observes that, I quote, democracy has its foundation respect for the human person and the rule of law. Democracy is the best safeguard of freedom of expression, tolerance of all groups of society, and equality of opportunity for each person, end of quote. Despite of all our differences, the main principles of democracy are rooted to many OSCE documents and belong to our common achievements. These achievements were challenged in recent years. Being established on the Helsinki Decalogue and consensus-based decision-making, our organization today could become less and less effective when Russia is violating the very 10 Helsinki principles and misusing the consensus for own benefit. Illegal occupation and attempted annexation by Russia of parts of Ukraine is unprecedented in Europe since the end of the World War II. This caused a great gap in the OSCE toolbox that does not have any applicable measures or mechanism for the situation of occupation. For example, the misuse by occupying power of democratic tools of referendum and elections in this situation places unique significant challenge to the established ODIHR observation methodology, which must be duly updated by this institution
I can see a point
itself.
of order. Excuse me, I have to interrupt you. Please, Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you for interrupting that speech. I have to take the floor with regard to the that Russia has been blamed for annexation and occupation. Be careful with the words that you use. This is a point of order. Attempts to use this tribune.
A remark that point of order has to do with procedural issues. If you want to exercise your right of reply, you will be able to do that in the end of this session. Thank you. Representative of Ukraine, you may continue. Thank you.
We were expecting that you will decline this point of order, Mr. Moderator, because this is unbearable to do that among the participating states when they are making national statements. So this situation of occupation and annexation made for all...
I can see another point of order. Excuse me. That was the old one. You may continue. I'm sorry.
Director, you should do something about moderation. For the OSCE, which places respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms at the core of its comprehensive approach to security, protection of human rights in this situation of occupation remains a key unresolved challenge. Russia's objection and denials have prevented the OSCE from using the available instruments of response. It remains crucial to continue to seek practical ways to address serious human rights violations by the occupying authorities in Crimea and the occupied parts of Donbas. There is a particular role of the OSCE institutions in monitoring and reporting of the human rights situation in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Ruled by revanchist aspirations, Russia undermines the democratic principles and mechanism in democratic states by spreading disinformation and fake news, supporting ultra-left and ultra-right political forces as well as populist parties. The digital era posed new threats to our...
I kindly ask you to conclude.
Irreversible 1990 commitments to build the strength and strengthen democracy and cooperate with the aim of making democratic gains. Any random combination of authoritarian tendencies, populism, post-truth politics, propaganda and fake news...
I kindly ask you to conclude.
I'm concluding. Distorted or falsified information of voting systems, weak political institution, political corruption, restriction on opposing with the new information system and social media
kindly ask
has
you to
become...
conclude.
I'm finishing the big sentence, Mr. Moderator. has become real threat for democracy in all our participating states, that we should cope with in line with the OSCE principles and commitments.
Thank you. I will now pass the floor to the Azerbaijan Press Council, to be followed by the Union of Informed Citizens. Azerbaijan Press Council, you have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Azira Sret. I represent the Press Council of Azerbaijan. Myself, personally, for several times, I have been part of an international mission to observe elections in other countries, and of course in Azerbaijan. And this is why I can tell you about that practice from my own experience. Since I represent the Press Council of Azerbaijan, I can add that the Council works together with the Central Election Commission of Azerbaijan, means that we create a contact group each time there are elections that help in the work of journalists during the electoral period. This group tries to resolve disputes, and under our laws, journalists, of course, don't have to register or be accredited to observe elections. In other words, journalists have free access to all polling stations, and they can freely gather information and then to report on it. One of the speakers today already said that in December of this year in Azerbaijan, we're going to have municipal elections. As journalists, of course, we're preparing for that. The Council of the Press is also preparing for that. However, it must be noted that in Azerbaijan, not all territories will hold these elections. That is because 20% of our territory is being occupied by Armenia. This is why 750,000 Azeris who have had to flee their homes will not be able to take part in the municipal elections. Amin Guseyev spoke today, saying that supposedly he cannot obtain grants because the authorities of Azerbaijan are standing in his way. This person, first of all, is not a citizen of Azerbaijan. Secondly, he does not live in Azerbaijan. And of course, he does not fall under the jurisdiction of Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now pass the floor to the Union of Informed Citizens, to be followed by Movement Alga Karakalpakstan. Union of Informed Citizens, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. In recent years and decades, we have witnessed that various countries with previously democratic elections have begun to falsify elections. These frauds occur both on election day and before by eliminating competition. In this regard, I'm pleased and happy to note the positive changes that we have seen during last year's elections in Armenia. The next milestone in this regard should be building the institutional grounds for democratic elections so that it does not depend on political will of the authorities. Moreover, I'm pleased to note that the page of democratic elections was opened not only in Armenia, but also in Nagorno-Karabakh, where local elections were held just 10 days ago. With our partners from Transparency International, we decided to conduct a large-scale observation mission in Nagorno-Karabakh, where we had 180 observers in about 250 polling stations. As a result, we came to the conclusion that despite all the issues, the elections were competitive and democratic. Even more, this was the first time that the opposition, both in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, did not contest the election results.
Mr. Moderator.
It is.
Yeah, I see the point of order, please.
I think there is misunderstanding. The representative of Armenian NGO is talking about Azerbaijani lands that I think you should stop it. Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of what he should talk about.
I think if you want to exercise your right of reply, you will be able to do it in the end of the session. I now, in full respect to the freedom of expression, I'm moving
the part of Azerbaijani lands.
I am passing the floor back to the speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm talking about elections in OSCE region. I mean, it is not secret that Nagorno-Karabakh has disputed status and that Azerbaijan considered it as its occupied territory. But for us, democratic values are the most important. I will not compare the elections in Nagorno-Karabakh with elections in Azerbaijan, as we have not observed elections in Azerbaijan, but you all know the level of democracy in Azerbaijan from OSCE.
Excuse me, I do have another
report.
point of order, please. What is the procedural point of order you would like to raise?
I would like to the gentleman to invite to urge the gentleman not to talk about Azerbaijani issues, because he is hinting the Azerbaijani
What is the
lands.
procedural
He has
point of
got
order that you would like
political-
to raise?
And he has got political issue in his talks. Here is not political platform.
In full respect to the freedom of expression in this venue, I will pass the floor to the speaker. And I see the point of order withdrawn. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. In any status, it is independent from the status. People living in any territory has a right to elect their local authorities, heads of their villages, heads of their cities. And unlike territories occupied by Russia from neighboring countries, people in Nagorno-Karabakh live in much more democratic environment than they will live or they would live in Azerbaijan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to the movement Alga Karakalpakstan, to be followed by Regional Public Organization Youth Society of Tajik Students in St. Petersburg, movement Alga Karakalpakstan. Please, you have the floor.
Distinguished participants of the conference and guests, Karakalpakstan is a sovereign republic. Today it is occupied by Uzbekistan. Karakalpakstan is a sovereign parliamentary republic which does not have the right to create Karakalpakstan political parties. In order to develop ourselves on the principle of parliamentarianism, need to create parties in Karakalpakstan. At the same time, the authorities of Uzbekistan in December will hold parliamentary elections as well as elections to the parliament of Karakalpakstan. We are not talking about any opposition parties, because Karakalpakstan does not have any parties, because we are banned from creating a party of Karakalpakstan. Which organization bans the creation of even NGOs, which would be independent from the government of Uzbekistan? After I spoke here last year, everything became much worse in Karakalpakstan. On the 14th of December, the Uzbek state forces banned us from holding the celebration of the Day of Constitution of Karakalpakstan. Now, on the 12th of May, the state authorities arrested people, waged terror, arrests, torture, beatings are now how they deal with people in Karakalpakstan. The Orbek Kurbanov was beaten. He was arrested together with other rights defenders who were planning to travel to Tashkent to meet with the representatives from Human Rights Watch. Political prisoner Abkhad Shilchayev and other rights defenders are still in the jails of Uzbekistan. We must all understand Karakalpakstan is a sovereign parliamentary republic. It is not Uzbekistan. We need to be able to have free elections with the participation of all parties in Karakalpakstan, for local bodies and to the Karakalpakstan parliament. What is standing in the way is the president of the neighboring Uzbekistan. He is not prepared to do this, because last year we had a proposal to use the OSCE platform and through the United Nations to have a dialogue between Karakalpakstan Now, if we want democratic changes in Uzbekistan, then Mirziyoyev must put an end to the policy of occupation against the sovereign republic of Karakalpakstan. To do this, Uzbekistan must stop and withdraw their occupation forces from the territory of Karakalpakstan to hold elections. Thank you.
Before I pass the floor, I would like to remind the delegations that the delegations can exercise their right of reply. To do so, they can register with with my colleagues behind me. I now will pass the floor to the Regional Public Organization Youth Society of Tajik Students in St. Petersburg, to be followed by International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Organize. We're very grateful for being invited to such a serious and important event on protecting human rights. My name is Aminjan Abdurrahimov, and I'm president of a regional organization of young Tajikistan students in Russia. And I would like to note that despite the fact that we're a young organization, we already have representatives in 25 regions of the Russian Federation. And we would now like officially to register our organization in Europe. We have more than 25,000 Tajikistan students just in the Russian Federation. There are others in other countries. Now, we are an independent organization. We have a view of the present situation when it comes to elections in Tajikistan that may differ somewhat from what we've heard so far. We believe that in 2015 it was shown that the people of Tajikistan freely and independently chose the current government, and I would like to note that in Tajikistan at the time of the elections, representatives of Western and Eastern countries were invited. There were also representatives of various international and civil society organizations to monitor, and they came to the conclusion that everything was done in accordance with international standards and was fully transparent. And I would also like to note that migrants do have the possibility to vote from abroad, from outside, if they are not on the territory of the Republic at the time of the election. So a lot of questions arise. Where are these falsified data coming from? Where is this false information coming from the self-interested people? It seems to me that the self-interested group does not accept international standards, or maybe they have their own standards for evaluating or assessing elections. So I would call on this self-interested group not to put its interests before those of the people, because that results in division and destabilization of the Tajikistan people. We are an example of an exemplar of a democratic institution. We have our own statute. No one can undermine our rights. We elect our own leaders. And to close, I would like to call on the leadership of the OSCE, the European governments and international organizations to reach their own conclusions on the basis of genuine sociological surveys of the population itself of the Republic of Tajikistan, and not to believe in unverified information. And I would also like to call on the ODIHR to make sure that those participating in this meeting are in fact fully registered participants.
To be followed by the representative of the organization who was not in the room when we were trying to pass the floor. Now we have the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you. IFES is an international organization that works on a wide array of issues related to elections and the political process in countries all around the world. But today I'd like to focus specifically on the political rights of people with disabilities. So the World Health Organization estimates that 15% of the world's population has a disability, but in every single OSCE participating state, people with disabilities still experience numerous barriers to their political engagement. The most obvious, I think, is physical barriers to the polling station, to accessing political party debates, to parliaments. There's also information barriers. Voter education information is not produced in sign language, for example. People who use screen readers are usually not able to access the websites of an election commission or of a political party's platform. There's also legal barriers. A majority of countries around the world, say either directly or indirectly, have clauses saying that people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities are not allowed to vote. Many states also have clauses that say if you speak the native language of the country, then that's the only way that you're allowed to run for office. And that does not include, for example, sign language. So if you speak sign language, you're not allowed to run for office. There are attitudinal and stigma barriers in a majority of countries around the world that discourage people with disabilities from participating in political life. And there's also there's a lack of leadership opportunities to serve as candidates, as poll workers, as election observers. So yesterday, ODIHR had a side event on releasing their handbook on promoting the participation of people with disabilities. So one recommendation that IFES would like to make is that everyone in this room take a look at that handbook produced by ODIHR and put into action some of the recommendations that are mentioned in there. Secondly, another recommendation would be, it would be great if every future HDEM meeting, there could be a session specifically focused on disability rights. Then lastly, I'd like to recommend a ministerial council decision on political participation of people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 6 speakers on my list remaining. We are running very close to the time limit. I will have to limit the time of the speeches to 2 minutes, if you allow. And the next on my list is the representative of the region, Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy of the Republic of Crimea, named after Paisi Hilendarsky, to be followed by European Exchange. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Distinguished participants, delegates. My name is Svrnovic. I represent the Regional Bulgarian Autonomy. I am the head of that organization. Let me start by saying that I believe that the topic selected for today is very topical and important. For it to be more useful, I think it would be a good idea for participants of this session, representatives of NGOs from various countries, should not talk about so much which is negative in their countries, but to share their experiences so that when we go back home, we could try to use this good experience from other countries in our own. I wanted to talk about public or social control of elections in the Russian Federation. This is a responsibility of the bodies of the Russian Federation. These electoral bodies are created in all regions of the Russian Federation. In Crimea of this year, we held elections to the authorities at the local level and the legislative authorities with the participation of observers from NGOs who were able to monitor what was happening by registering with the public chamber. Now, in other words, everyone who took part in the observations were not political, they weren't members of political parties or associations, or were not representatives of the stakeholders who took part in the elections themselves.
Please.
This instrument is being used throughout Russia. I took part in elections oversight as well.
We have to be moving on. The next speaker on my list is the European Exchange, to be followed by Promolex. European Exchange, please.
European Exchange hosts the secretariat of the European Platform for Democratic Elections, which is a coalition of 14 independent citizen election observer organizations from the countries of the European Eastern Neighborhood. We evaluated the conditions for domestic observers in the region and concluded that in Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, and Ukraine, we saw overall enabling conditions for the work of domestic election observers, but in Azerbaijan and Belarus, a considerably restricted environment. And Russia represents a complete outlier in the region where the electoral law does not include any provisions for the direct accreditation of independent citizen observers. Recent regional elections in Russia once again show the continuous devaluation of the institution of elections in this country. The authorities employ 3 main tools to hinder domestic election monitoring: through discrediting campaigns in state-controlled media and by labeling election monitoring NGOs as foreign agents. Russian authorities present these organizations as traitors to the nation. The largest election monitoring network, Golos, was under the first to be labeled as a foreign agent. Another powerful tool is intimidation and harassment. Recently, house searches, interrogations, and arrests of Golos coordinators took place. Leading Golos expert Roman Udot is under house arrest since May 2019 under dubious accusations. Third common method used is the isolation of citizen election observers from the outside world. International partner organizations and donors are being listed by Russian authorities as undesirable foreign organizations, shortly UFO. Each Russian citizen risks up to 6 years in prison for any cooperation with undesirable organizations. EPGE itself and our Lithuanian member organization have been listed as UFOs in March 2018, shortly before the presidential elections in Russia. Since that time, we were forced to cut the cooperation with our Russian member organization Golos. We urge the Russian... two sentences. We urge the Russian authorities and the authorities of Azerbaijan and Belarus to follow their obligations and to provide unrestricted conditions for domestic election observers. We call on the Russian government to allow for accreditation.
Thank you.
For independent domestic observers and to abolish the unconstitutional laws on foreign agents and on undesirable foreign organizations.
We'll be
Thank
moving
you.
on the floor. Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Promolex, to be followed by Spain. Promolex, you have the floor, up to 2 minutes maximum.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I would like to inform distinguished audience about some of the positive electoral developments in my country, but also to draw your attention to the less positive ones. The newly elected parliament returned to the proportional electoral system and addressed several international recommendations. On certain other issues, previous recommendations have been also partially addressed, including on lowering ceilings for donations, introducing ceilings for cash donations, allowing financing from diaspora, out-of-country voting, and enhancing women's participation. Still, many inconsistencies remain unaddressed. On October 20th, Republic of Moldova will hold general local elections concurrently with the new parliamentary elections in 4 single-member constituencies. In this context, Promolex is particularly worried about the following issues. First, it should be reminded that the Moldovan parliament had a very weak response to the Constitutional Court's request on closing the legal gaps identified in the course of 2016 presidential elections, especially with regard to the sanctioning of religious cults involved in the electoral campaigns, incrimination of electoral corruption, and better regulation of the procedure for contesting elections. Second, I would like to emphasize the fact that the elections campaign in Moldova are suffocated by the misuse of administrative resources. The problem exists due to the lack of an explicit regulation of this phenomena. Another problem is the lack of an effective mechanism to monitor political financing. For 4 years already, the state budget is financing the activity of political parties, and the Central Election Commission is still not able to ensure an efficient control on the way the money is spent. Next, although the Parliament has addressed the recommendation to allow citizens living abroad to finance the electoral campaign, for the new parliamentary elections, funding is still not allowed. They can, however, support the candidates running for the general local elections organized on the same day. Speaking about the upcoming local elections, about 7% of the total number of voters who have neither a domicile nor a residence following the experience from the past elections risk not to be able to vote. Further, Promolex is concerned about the quality of the voters list. Despite the negative population growth and massive migration, we are witnessing a permanent increase in the number of voters. And the last issue, the legal provisions that apply for registration of candidates are also inequitable. In conclusion, Promolex called the Moldovan authorities to find solutions and to ensure a broad social and political consensus for the remedy of these deficiencies.
Thank you. I will have to be moving on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Spain, to be followed by Czech Republic. Spain, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor moderador.
Thank you, moderator. To complement what was stated on behalf of the European Union, Spain believes that institutions are created by law. And law is the democratic instrument that makes it possible to guarantee rights and to make sure that they do not go too far. I mean, institutions are at the service of individuals. And that is why it is the individuals who decide who is to sit on institutions through free and secret and fair elections. And that's a reality in many countries of Europe. And the OSCE has played a fundamental role in this regard. Each state decides on the basis of its own constitution and legislation how power is to be divided among various territorial levels. What is clear is that people who want dictatorship but don't want the law to limit their power, and their argument is that democracy is below the law. But in order to be able to exercise a democracy, you must be able to say who can vote and how votes are counted. If it's not all done in accordance with strict rules based on the law, you don't have real elections. So my first recommendation would be to apply what the OSCE says in its publication on the electoral framework. The essential aspect of free and fair elections is the written law. Now, that is not the only threat weighing on democratic institutions. More and more frequently, campaigns and electoral processes are being attacked on the internet by trolls and so on. Very well-established democracies are, in fact, using manual counting in order to avoid piracy. And that's a new challenge for all of us in the OSCE. It's related to a whole series of human rights, but election observation must also include observation online to make sure that rights win over democracy.
The list, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Czech Republic, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. The Czech Republic aligns with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union, but I would like to give some remarks in my national capacity. First of all, the Czech Republic would like to underline our full support for ODIHR's mandate and autonomy and its internationally recognized election observation methodology. When it comes to recommendation, we would like to provide two. First, we would like to encourage all OEC participating states to follow up to recommendations of OEC election observation missions. The meeting of the Human Dimension Committee held in May 2019 underlined the OEC commitments in this area and stressed why it is important to follow up on electoral recommendations. The participants of the meeting discussed with ODIHR what activities and actors should be involved in an effective national follow-up. The Czech Republic hosted an ODIHR follow-up electoral mission in November 2018, and we have also submitted a voluntary report to ODIHR regarding the implementation of recommendations by Czech national authorities. Our second recommendation is we would encourage all participating states to provide sufficient number of observers to all OSCE election observation missions. I am proud to announce that the Czech Republic has so far contributed observers to all OEC election observation missions this year, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will now give the floor to the last speaker on my list, that is Bosnia and Herzegovina. Please, you have the floor.
Bosnia and Herzegovina aligns with the statement delivered by the Poland on behalf of European Union, but let me say a few remarks in my national capacity. Bosnia and Herzegovina, same like other participating states, is committed to upholding key principles of democratic elections. We highly value all support provided from ODIHR election and other departments. We take with high consideration all election observation assessment reports and recommendations for improvement of the electoral process, not only because it is our commitment from 1999 Istanbul Summit, but also because some paragraphs of our current electoral legislation has been assessed by relevant international courts as discriminatory. In between two last electoral cycles, Bosnia and Herzegovina authorities fully implemented 7, mostly implemented 3, and partially implemented 8 ODIHR recommendations. For example, ODIHR recommendation that constituencies and the number of mandates for the state and sub-state parliaments should be periodically reviewed to ensure equality of vote was considered in previous electoral cycle by the Republic of Srpska National Assembly, which adopted significant changes in this regard. However, there is more to do. Precondition for further reforms in implementation of election results from the last elections currently blocked already 11 months due to unreasonable preconditions claimed by some political actors. Core issue of electoral reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not about implementation of ODIHR recommendations. It is also about the concept of current electoral system based on civic principles, while the constitution of the country is ethnocentric. This clash between ethno-national and civic principle caused a number of issues, including international and domestic court interventions in a number of cases. Proper balance between these two has to be taken into consideration in any further reforms. In short, the civic principles have to be adjusted with parity principle that is implemented in order to ensure equality between 3 constituent peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We welcome recent statement of Chairman in Office Miroslav Lajčák supporting the principles that none of 3 constituent nations of Bosnia and Herzegovina must not be overridden by any other 2. This principle has to be fully implemented in electoral legislation.
Thank you.
In conclusion, I would like to express gratitude to all participating states to contribute to the ODIHR Election Observation and Diversification Fund that enhances diversity and geographical balance in ODIHR election observation. Thank you.
Those are nice things to hear, but I do have to ask you to conclude. We have literally 2 minutes left until the end of the session. I have 11 participating states who want to exercise the right of reply. I want to give 30 seconds to the introducer to try to do the impossible and to pick up what she feels has been the most important things mentioned today. Literally 30 seconds, if that is possible at all, and then we will go through the list of the rights of reply.
During this thematic session, many specific problems have been highlighted, often of a national and regional nature and frequently voiced with passion. While some topics clearly fall outside the scope of this afternoon's session, others are symptoms of shortcomings in the electoral processes and deficits in democracy. Constructively, we have heard words of encouragement for greater participation of citizens in the democratic process, including via civil society. Speakers have remarked on the value of ODIHR election observation methodology and handbooks. There were also suggestions on how electoral observation can be further improved. Positively, we have heard from participating states that are making good use of ODIHR recommendations and words of encouragement for all participating states to implement recommendations. That's it.
Thank you. I will give the floor to, in the order on my list, for the rights to reply. I have 11 delegations. The maximum time is 1 minute. I would encourage you to use less than 1 minute if we want to conclude the session sooner. Thank you in advance for that. The first on my list is Albania, please.
Thank you, moderator. In response to some allegations made here today regarding the ethnic minorities in Albania, allow me to quote the ODIHR final report on election observation mission 2019 in Albania. The law provides for full political, civil, and social rights for persons belonging to national minorities and guarantees the right to vote and to stand for election to all citizens regardless of ethnic background, race, religion, or language. Campaigning in national minority language is permitted and was observed in several municipalities, notably in Pustek and Finnish. No instances of discrimination were observed against national minorities during the election process. End of quote. Albania considers the Greek minority as well as other 8 national minorities living in Albania as part of the precious value of our society, which, as you are well aware, is traditionally characterized by harmony, coexistence, and tolerance. While ethnic, religious relations continue to be good, Albania significantly improved the legal and policy framework for the protection of minorities by adopting in October 2017 a specific law on minorities.
Thank you.
I will distribute it. Thank
you.
But they were speaking more.
I will be passing the floor now to Latvia, to be followed by the United States of America. Latvia, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. In reply to civil society representatives who mentioned non-citizens and certain aspects of naturalization in Latvia, a large amount of data was mentioned. Not all was incorrect. However, it was out of context. I wish to outline that even though Latvia is not a successor state of the USSR, it granted privileged status and preferential access to citizenship to former Soviet citizens transferred to Latvia by the Soviet regime. These are the non-citizens. They are in no way stateless persons, as it has been acknowledged by UNHCR. Non-citizens have the same social guarantees as Latvian citizens and enjoy most political rights. The status is a temporary one, therefore Latvia continuously facilitates the naturalization procedure. For example, last year, 99% of children born in Latvia were Latvia's citizens. However, it is true that our parliament is currently deciding on draft legislation that would completely abolish non-citizen status for newborns.
Please conclude.
This is
the
yet
next
to be...
speaker on my list is the United States of America, to be followed by Kazakhstan.
I wish to exercise my right of reply in response to the intervention of the Russian Federation, which alleged that ODIHR electoral observation no longer represents the gold standard. I could not disagree more. ODIHR and OSCE Parliamentary Assembly remain our best eyes and ears into electoral processes and practices of our countries. Any tarnishing, I would argue, is a result of certain participating states' disagreements with the organization's thoughtful and unbiased recommendations. We are glad that free elections confer the legitimacy of government. We are also glad that OSCE strives to support those free elections and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. The next on my list is Kazakhstan, to be followed by Tajikistan. Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. When we try to have wholesale accusations, it does not help us. Two NGOs from Kazakhstan today, in their statements, brandied about these negative assessments. Firstly, they were talked about the courts and trials, but I have the facts. Only 73 proceedings took place, and these were not mass violations, but individual breaches. Secondly, it was said that these were the cruelest elections ever. But why did they say that? The liberal legislation, especially with regard to national observers, is the fact, and this was also said in the preliminary observations of the ODIHR missions. There were 143 observers that took part in these elections. None of them have been held responsible, in spite of the fact that there were multiple violations by observers themselves.
On my list is Tajikistan, to be followed by Belarus. Tajikistan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. We heard three so-called opposition organizations, or NGOs, claiming that there's no democracy, no democratic elections in Tajikistan. But I would like to inform you that these organizations were identified by the Supreme Court of Tajikistan as extremist terrorist organizations, and they simply came to Europe and changed their names, and now they participate in this high-level meeting.
John, Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. On the 17th of November of 2019, we will have elections for the National Assembly of Belarus. This decree was signed by the president on the 5th of August. The authorities and the government have on numerous occasions noted that Belarus will be holding open elections fully in line with the national laws and global standards. We're interested for the new parliament to include all layers of society and various points of view. It was noted that it's important to support women candidates. Preparations for elections is being held fully in line with our national laws. We have the Central Election Commission is working. They held a meeting with a number of political parties and NGOs. And the candidates are now gathering their necessary signatures. Under our obligations, Belarus has also invited the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE as observers. Thank you.
To be followed by Uzbekistan. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In reply to the Armenian so-called NGO representative, my delegation underlines once again that Nagorno-Karabakh is an integral part of the Republic of Azerbaijan. The referral by the Armenian NGO representative, so-called elections in the next show, presented under the cover of some elections. However, there are well-known realities for everyone, no matter what elections they try to talk about in conditions of military aggression, occupation, continuous ethnic cleansing, and other illegal actions. Neither these show under the cover of some elections, nor its results will be recognized and will not be recognized by the international community. At the same time, I would like to mention the procedures for local election observers to be accredited is very simple. They just need to give an application, just field application for getting accredited. And so far, Azerbaijan election commissions didn't reject anyone for accreditation.
Thank you.
Tens of thousands of election observers have been accredited last elections.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Uzbekistan, to be followed by Russian Federation. Uzbekistan, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I would like to note in connection with an NGO statement that Karakalpakstan is an integral part of Uzbekistan. It's one of the well-developing regions of Uzbekistan. All citizens of Uzbekistan have the same rights with no discrimination whatsoever. They are treated in the same way. At the present time, the parliament of the country has 7 members from Karakalpakstan. One of them is a committee chairman. In the other house of our parliament, we have 9 members from Karakalpakstan. Now, in connection with the imprisonment of certain individuals in Karakalpakstan, that information was provided last year. It's completely unreliable and unverified. The individuals were imprisoned under normal law.
Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Right of reply with regard to the statement of the Ukrainian colleague. The Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol are full-fledged members of the Russian Federation as a result of the internationally acknowledged right to self-determination. This right was realized through democratic means by the holding of a national referendum with 95% show. We also heard complaints with regard to the supposed violations in human rights in the so-called Autonomous Republic of Crimea. In 2014, Since 2014, there's a subject of the Russian Federation, the Republic of Crimea. The concerns of Ukraine and supposed violations of election rights of the people in Crimea looks like hypocrisy. The Ukrainian authorities closed their diplomatic posts in Russia, have prevented their own citizens who live in Russia, about 3.5 million people, to take part in the elections of president of that country and in the parliamentary elections. Thank you.
I am now passing the floor to Finland on behalf of the European Union, to be followed by Ukraine. Finland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I pass the floor to Ambassador of the European Union.
Thank you. In reply to some remarks that have been made during this session, we'd like to reiterate our well-known position on the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russia. We did not, do not, and will not recognize it. On another point, we reiterate our strong support for ODIHR's election observation methodology, which is globally recognized and applied in the same manner in all participating states, is based on the principles of independence, impartiality, and professionalism, as spelled out in the Ministerial Council Decision 1906, has been endorsed by all participating states, and has been used by other organizations, including the European Union, as a basis for developing their own guidelines. There can be no artificial balance in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I am now passing the floor to Ukraine, to be followed by Armenia. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank the civil society, APORA, Group of Influence, and European Youth of Ukraine for their recommendations, which those in line with the responsibilities of the government will be communicated to the capital. Secondly, Crimean Peninsula is Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, and the UN supports this position, as many other delegations here, almost all. As for attempts of the Russian Federation to mislead the regime on the provisions of the Copenhagen document, I would like to remind them that the participating states invite the observers from other participating state to the extent permitted by the law, and Ukraine, in its letter on invitation to the ODIHR, drew attention of the ODIHR to the two specific laws of Ukraine, in which one recognizes Russia as aggressor state and occupying power, and two others on elections stipulate, in particular, that a person who is a citizen of the state recognized by Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine as aggressor state, occupying state, as well as the person those nominating was affiliated or submitted by this state, recognized by the Verkhovna Rada as aggressor occupying state, cannot act as official observer. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Armenia, to be followed by the last speaker, that will be Canada. Armenia, you have the.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to the comments of the Azerbaijani delegation, I would recommend that delegation to refrain from giving out desirable for valid. It should be once again reiterated that 25 years ago, exercising their constitutional right to self-determination, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh developed effectively functioning democratic state institutions, organized their public life through free and fair democratic order, whereby elections have been regularly conducted and monitored by various international observers. The recent local elections on 8th of September were described as free, transparent, and held in an atmosphere of mutual respect, as stated by various observation missions, including transparency from the Transparency International and the Civil Society Organization, which was awarded which was granted Democracy Defender Award by 36 OSCE participating states. Concluding, I'd like to say that presidential and parliamentary elections are scheduled for the next year in Nagorno-Karabakh, which will be another step in building a truly democratic country. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker on my list to exercise the right of reply is Canada, please.
Thank you, Moderator. As the Russian intervention raised concerns about ODIHR's electoral methodology, we would like to briefly reiterate our position. ODIHR's election observation methodology is widely and rightfully recognized as a model of independence, impartiality, and professionalism. Canada respects the autonomy and independence of ODIHR, as well as its transparent, well-established, and well-known methodology. We fully support ODIHR and its important mandate to conduct election observation in an effective and credible way. Respecting ODIHR's independence in fulfilling its mandate means respecting our organization and its institutions. Regarding the Russian claim on Crimea, we would reiterate that we do not and will not recognize the attempted illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Thank you.
Thank you. This brings this session to an end. I will not make long speeches. I just want to thank you all for making your comments, for making your statements. I especially want to thank those who made very concrete and specific recommendations. The points will be well taken. We will be studying those recommendations. We will be looking at them. Once again, thank you to all. And I want to especially thank the interpreters who have so kindly continued with us beyond the time limit. Thank you to everybody. There will be side events taking place in the evening. Please, we already ate a little bit into their time, but please join the side events and enjoy the rest of HDM.